The sea washes up nothing but trash, said the village head, and asked if he was trash. Doyeon remained silent, not because he couldn't think of an answer, but because he saw seagulls flying low, large mussels that no one had gathered, fish swimming right at the surface, a veritable treasure right under the noses of people who are gnawing on tree bark out of hunger. But let's rewind a couple of hours. The first thing he feels is sand in his mouth, wet, crammed between his teeth so tightly it's as if someone had poured it in on purpose. Then the smell hits him. Iodine, rotting seaweed. He inhales and starts coughing. A lump of brown mucus shoots out of his throat. His body won't obey him. The skin on his back burns as if it had been scraped with sandpaper. A sunburn. A severe one. So he hasn't been lying here for just an hour. And then he hears laughter. A child's. Sarcastic. Something is poking him in the ribs. A stick. He opens his eyes. 3 boys are standing over him. The oldest is about 10. Their clothes look like burlap that someone has turned into something resembling jackets. One of them pokes him with the stick again and shouts to the others that the corpse twitched, which means he won the bet. Doyeon sits up. The boys jump back. He looks around. A narrow strip of gray sand between the rocks. Brown hills with sparse grass. Not a single pole. Not a single wire. Not a single concrete structure. He looks at his hands. The same calluses from the ropes on his palms. But the shirt he's wearing isn't his. It's rough, made of something like linen. His pants, cut off at the knees, are tied with a rope. No boots, no socks. He remembers the car, the winding road above the bay, his heavy eyelids after the conference, and then the black water, cold, oppressing, and the thought of the seatbelt that came too late. But there's no bay here, no car, just the shore, smelling of rotten mussels, and 3 dirty kids in medieval rags. And that's when the professional kicks in. Doyeon fixes his gaze on the high tide line. At least 3 types of seaweed, kelp, something like fucus. The low tide line indicates that the water receded about 3 hours ago. That means the tide will come back in 3 hours. Mussels sit in clusters on the rocks. Big ones. No one's touching them. Seagulls slice through the air right at the water's edge. Low. Very low. And that means one thing. The fish are near the surface. His body is still shivering from the cold, but his mind is already reading the shore like a page in a textbook. He turns to the most brazen of the boys. He asks if bamboo grows here. The kid frowns. He snaps that the bamboo is behind the hill by the stream, and that the vagrant had better get out of here before the adults show up. Doyeon stands up. His legs buckle. He steadies himself. Hunger twists his stomach into a tight knot. But there is bamboo, and there is the sea, and he knows the sea. The sea is the same everywhere. He walks toward the hill. The boys trail behind him, keeping their distance, as if following a dangerous beast. Over the ridge, a village comes into view. 40 houses, maybe fewer. Walls of stone and clay. The thatched roofs have sagged so much that it must surely leak inside every time it rains. Not a single boat longer than 3 steps. Just flat-bottom boats that look like troughs. You wouldn't venture out to the open sea in those. The people here are thin. Very thin. A woman by a house is mending something resembles a net, but it isn't a net, just a rag with holes in it. 2 old men stare into the void with the kind of gaze you see in famine-stricken regions, the gaze of a person who has stopped hoping. A young boy breaks away and runs toward the village. A minute later, an old man comes out to meet him. He's short. His back is hunched, not from age, but from the habit of bowing. His eyes are sharp and angry. The village elder. You can tell by the way everyone steps back. He sizes Doyeon up from head to toe, even though Doyeon is a head shorter than him. He asks who he is and where he's from. Doyeon replies that the sea washed him ashore, and then the village elder blurts out something about trash. Doyeon remains silent because he notices a little girl, about 5 years old. She's standing around the corner, chewing on tree bark. The child is chewing on the bark. He shifts his gaze to the village headman. He asks how long it's been since there was any decent fish in the village. The village headman tenses up. His eyes grow angrier. They don't give anything to vagrants here. Doyeon nods. He says he only needs some bamboo and 2 hours. If he doesn't bring back any fish in 2 hours, he'll leave and won't bother them again. The village head is silent for a long time. Then he waves his hand. It's not permission, it's just a half-hearted gesture. Doyeon walks to the stream. The bamboo grows thickly, thick stalks. He cuts 3 with a stone because he has no knife. His hands remember. 4 years on commercial trawlers taught him to work with whatever's at hand. He splits the trunk into flexible strips. His fingers fly. A conical trap, a venter, a design thousands of years old. The funnel is wide on the inside, narrow on the outside. The fish swims in after the bait and can't find its way out. Korean fishermen in the Bering Sea used to make these in 15 minutes. It takes him 40. His hands are shaking from hunger, but the trap is ready. He heads down to the shore. He finds a crevice in the rocks right at the water's edge, the perfect spot. The ebb tide exposes the seabed, and the fish retreat into the channels between the rocks. The incoming tide carries them back right through cracks like these. He sets the trap with the opening facing against the current. Inside, he places a crushed hermit crab. There are plenty of them here. No one collects them. He sits down on a rock and waits. The villagers watch from the embankment. One of the women remarks that the vagabond has gone completely mad. He's sitting by the rocks, waiting for who knows what. The boys settle in closer. They're waiting for some fun. And the water is changing. The tide is coming in. The foam reaches the first rocks. The water level rises by a palm's width. Then 2. The current flows into the crevice, right where the trap is set. Doyeon waits. An hour and a half, 2 hours. When the water rises, he wades in knee-deep and pulls up the trap. It's heavy, very heavy. Silver flutters inside. He dumps the contents onto the rocks. A horse mackerel, fat and large, about 11 kilograms. And 2 flounders, wide and flat, fresh, alive. Silence hangs over the embankment. Absolute silence. Even the boys fall quiet. Doyeon takes out a sharp shard of shell and gets to work. He cuts the gills of each fish at a single point, quickly, precisely. Blood trickles onto the rocks. Ikejime, a method of bleeding the fish that triples its shelf life. No one here knows it. Fish without blood doesn't turn dark. It doesn't taste bitter. The flesh stays white and firm. The village elder walks down from the embankment, slowly. He stops 3 steps away. He looks at the pile of silvery bodies, at Doyeon's hands red with blood. He asks quietly, almost in a whisper, "Where did he learn this?" Doyeon doesn't look up. He replies that he'll teach the whole village, but he needs one thing, a roof over his head until spring. Behind the village head stands the entire village. 40 households of starving people, children gnawing on tree bark, and lying on the rocks is more fish than the whole village has seen in a month. The village head turns to the man standing next to him. He orders him to clear out the old shed by the dock. Doyeon continues working with the fish. His hands are no longer shaking. The shed turned out to be in worse shape than Doyeon had expected. One wall had caved in. The roof was leaking in 4 places. The floor was dirt and damp. But it was better than spending the night on the shore. He dragged an armful of dry grass inside and made a makeshift bed. He lay down and stared at the ceiling. through which he could see the stars. His whole body ached. The burns on his back throbbed. His stomach growled with hunger. Of those 11 kilograms of horse mackerel, he hadn't kept a single fish for himself. He gave it all away. It was a calculated move, not charity. A starving village won't believe words. A starving village will believe fish. In the morning, a sound woke him. Someone was scratching at the door. Doyeon opened it. A girl was standing on the threshold. The very same one. The one who had been gnawing on the bark. She silently held out a rag bundle to him. Inside were 3 baked roots, something like sweet potatoes or turnips. Doyeon took them. The girl ran away. He ate all 3 without really tasting them. It was the first food in this world that he'd ever put in his mouth. After that, he went out to the shore. Morning low tide. The perfect time. Doyeon walked around the shoreline for 2 hours. He counted. He analyzed. A habit from his days as an observer on a trawler. For 3 years, that was exactly what he'd done. He'd looked at the water and recorded everything he saw. Here, there was nothing to write on, but his mind worked just as it had before. The intertidal zone was rich. Mussels, sea urchins, several species of crabs, brown seaweed that was edible, all of it was literally lying right under his feet, and no one was gathering it. Why? Doyeon returned to the village and found the village head. He asked why no one was picking mussels off the rocks. The village head looked at him as if he were feeble-minded. He replied that mussels were food for dogs, and that no human would eat rocks from the shore. Doyeon nodded. He understood. A taboo, a superstition, or just ignorance. It didn't matter. He went back to the shore. He gathered 2 sacks of mussels. He found a flat rock. He built a fire using a fin. The mussels opened up in the heat within 3 minutes. Orange flesh, slightly sweet, tender. Doyeon ate half a bag, and for the first time, felt that his stomach didn't hurt. He cooked the other half in a clay pot he'd found in a dump behind the village. The broth turned out a bit cloudy, but fragrant. Doyeon carried the pot to the house where the girl with the bark lived. He set it on the threshold. He knocked, then he left. An hour later, he heard footsteps approaching. 2 men, young, strong, or once strong. Now they were thin, with sunken cheeks and dark circles under their eyes. They stood by his shed and said nothing. Then one of them spoke. He said his name was Taeseon, and that he'd seen Doyeon pull the fish out from among the rocks yesterday. He said his father had drowned in last year's storm, and that they'd had no breadwinner ever since. He had a younger brother and a mother who could barely get out of bed anymore. He asked if Doyeon could teach him how to make the same kind of trap. Doyeon looked at his hands, calloused, broad, the hands of a man who had worked his whole life. He replied that he could, but one trap wasn't enough. They needed nets, proper nets, not those rags they call nets around here, but real ones, with the right mesh size. Taeseon didn't understand what mesh size meant. Doyeon explained. If the mesh is too large, the fish swim right through the net. If it's too small, the net gets clogged with debris and seaweed and sinks. You need a mesh that catches fish of the right size and lets the young ones through. Taeseon listened with an expression as if someone were explaining how the universe works. The second man stayed behind as well. His name was Junho. He was a couple of years younger than Taeseon. He was quiet, his arms were even broader. Doyeon asked them to bring some bamboo and hemp rope. By noon, the 4 of them were sitting by the shed. Taeseon and Junho had brought 2 teenagers with them, a 16-year-old boy named Junho and a 17-year-old girl whom everyone simply called Eunbi. Doyeon was showing them how to weave a net, slowly, knot by knot, a simple sheet bend that wouldn't slip or come undone in the water. On the trawlers, they'd learn this in a day. Here, it took 3. Taeseon's fingers were too rough for such delicate work. Junho kept getting the loops mixed up, but Eunbi picked it up quickly. Her fingers flitted over the rope, and the knots lined up perfectly, one after another. Doyeon took note of this. On the 3rd day after his arrival, he set 4 traps at different points along the coastline. Each was placed where the tidal current created a natural vortex. The result? 32 kilograms of fish in a single tide. Horse mackerel, 4 flounders, 1 sea bass that Doyeon couldn't identify for sure, but which looked delicious. The village feasted. For the first time in a month, everyone ate their fill. Doyeon showed Taeseon how to gut a fish properly, not just to slit open the belly, but to make a precise incision from the throat to the anal fin without damaging the gallbladder. If bile gets on the meat, the bitterness can't be washed off. Taeseon nodded. He was taking it all in. His hands were rough, but his mind was quick. On the 4th day, a woman came to see Doyeon. She was tall and wiry, with weather-beaten hands and cracked skin on her knuckles. Her face was expressionless. She stood by the shed and looked at him in silence. Then she said her name was Yuna, the village headman's daughter, and that her father had asked her to keep an eye on the vagrant so he wouldn't get into trouble. Doyeon looked at her, then at her hands, her right hand, then her left. Yuna was left-handed. You could tell by the calluses, by the way she held her hands. He nodded and went back to work. Yuna sat down on a rock by the wall and watched, silently. She came every day. She would sit down silently and watch. Sometimes she helped carry the fish. Sometimes she adjusted the ropes on the traps. Not once did she praise him. Not once did she ask how he knew all this. She just watched. On the 5th day, Doyeon asked Taeseon to show him the village boats. Taeseon led him to the shore. 6 flat-bottomed boats, small ones. Doyeon examined each one. The bottoms were dried out. The sides were cracked. On 2 of the boats, the holes had been patched with mud and rags. You couldn't go more than 500 meters from the shore in these boats. Doyeon asked why the boats were so small. Taeseon replied that, by law, the wet ones were forbidden from owning a boat longer than 3 steps. The wet ones. That's what they called people without land. The clam gatherers. The lowest class. Doyeon asked who had come up with such a law. Taeseon replied that it had always been that way. Doyeon said nothing, but he remembered. On the 6th day, a problem arose. Doyeon set his traps as usual, but when he came to check them after high tide, 2 of the 4 were empty. Not just empty, broken. Someone had deliberately crushed the bamboo frames. A fish head lay on a rock nearby. A warning. Taeseon turned pale when he saw it. He said it was Daeho, the strongest man in the village, a 3rd-generation fisherman. He'd been fishing his whole life with his father's gear and believed that Doyeon was insulting the craft with his strange bamboo contraptions. Doyeon looked at the broken traps, then at the fish head. He looked up. A figure stood on the hill, broad-shouldered, arms crossed over his chest. Daeho looked down at him. Doyeon didn't shout. He didn't curse. He didn't go over to confront him. He sat down and began weaving new traps. An hour later, Yuna approached him. She looked at the debris. She looked at the hill where Daeho was standing. She said nothing. But that evening, Doyeon found a bundle of fresh bamboo by his shed. Very good bamboo. Much better than the kind he cut himself. A small knife lay on top of the bundle. Simple, sharp, with a wooden handle. Yuna didn't admit that it was from her, but no one else in the village had any reason to help a vagrant. Doyeon took the knife. He tested the blade. Good steel. Perhaps the finest thing he'd ever seen in this world. With this knife, the work went 3 times faster. By the end of the first week, Doyeon had 8 traps set at various points along the shore. His daily catch stabilized at 40 to 50 kilograms. That was enough to feed the entire village with some to spare. But the surplus was going bad. If left untreated, the fish would rot by the evening of the next day. Doyeon watched as the women threw away what they hadn't managed to eat, and every time, something inside him tightened. Because he knew how to preserve this fish for weeks, for months, he needed a smokehouse, and salt, and a place to dry it. But first, he needed the village to stop seeing him as a vagrant and start seeing him as a person. That was harder than catching fish. Salt in Haegyong cost more than meat. Doyeon learned this on the 8th day when he asked Yuna to buy him a sack at the market in Namhae. Yuna looked at him as if he'd asked her to buy the moon. She explained that a single sack of salt could cost the entire village a month's catch. The salt works belonged to the salt baron aristocrats. They controlled the prices and had no intention of lowering them, especially now during the Great Silence when the fish had disappeared and the only way to preserve what little remained was to salt it. But there was no salt. Doyeon sat down on a rock by the shore and thought for 2 hours. The sea. The salty sea. He estimated the salinity of the local water to be about 35 grams per liter, standard ocean salinity. Boil down a liter of seawater to get 35 grams of salt. Evaporate 1,000 liters and get 35 kilograms. The only question was the evaporation area and the fuel. He stood up and went to look for clay. He found it an hour later. A clay cliff behind the village. Gray, sticky clay. Perfect. Doyeon called out to Taeseon and Junho. He told them he needed some trays, wide and shallow, made of clay, fired in a bonfire. Taeseon asked why. Doyeon replied that he was going to make salt from the sea. Taeseon laughed. Then he saw the look on Doyeon's face and stopped. In 2 days, they made 12 trays. Each was the size of a door. They fired them in a pit, layering them with seaweed and dry bamboo. 4 cracked during firing. 8 survived. Doyeon arranged them on flat rocks on the southern slope, where the sun stayed longest. He poured seawater over them and waited. The wind and sun did their work in 3 days. A white coating remained at the bottom of each tray. Salt. Coarse, with impurities, but salt nonetheless. Doyeon gathered it up. He dissolved it again in fresh water. He strained it through a cloth. He evaporated it again on the trays. The second recrystallization yielded a pure white product, fine-grained, without any bitterness. A professional in Busan would have called this hand-harvested sea salt and sold it in pretty jars for good money. Here, it was simply magic. Yuna tasted the salt with the tip of her tongue. Her eyes widened. She looked at Doyeon and, for the first time in all those days, spoke to him. Not a command, nor a remark. She said it was good salt. Very good. Doyeon almost smiled. Now they could build a smokehouse. He found a spot, an old stone shed on the outskirts of the village. The walls were sturdy. The roof had half collapsed, but that was actually a good thing. They needed draft. Doyeon explained the principle to Taeseon and Junho. The fire is below. The smoke rises upward. The fish hang on poles in the smoke. It's not the flame that matters, but the smoke itself. The temperature must not exceed 60 degrees. Otherwise, the meat will boil instead of smoking. The best firewood is alder, or birch ash, or oak. No conifers. Pine needles produce bitter smoke and resin. Taeseon nodded, but Doyeon could tell he understood barely half of it. It didn't matter. The main thing was that he did it right. Understanding would come later. They repaired the shed's walls. They built a stone firebox inside. They set up poles for hanging the fish on 3 levels. Doyeon personally found a tree in the forest behind the hill that looked like an alder based on its bark and leaves. The first batch of fish went into the smokehouse 2 days later. 20 mackerels, gutted, bleed out using the ikejime, rubbed with his own sea salt, hung on the poles with a palm's width of space between the carcasses. Doyeon sat by the smokehouse all night. He tended the fire. He watched the smoke. He added wood chips. Yuna came after midnight. She sat down silently beside him. She handed him a roasted root. They sat by the fire in silence. Smoke rose through the cracks in the roof. It smelled of hot wood and salt. Toward morning, Doyeon took down the first fish, golden brown, firm. He split one open. The flesh inside was white and clean, not a single spot of rot. He gave half to Yuna. Yuna took a bite. She chewed slowly. Doyeon watched her face. She finished it in silence. Then she said she needed another one. For her father. Doyeon gave her 2. The smoked mackerel didn't spoil. Day 1. 2. 3. On the 4th day, it smelled and looked just as it did on the first. The village couldn't believe it. Women came to the smokehouse and touched the fish with their hands. They sniffed it. They shook their heads. An old woman whom everyone called Grandma Volhi said it was witchcraft and that it wouldn't end well. But she immediately asked for 2 for her grandchildren. Doyeon gave her 3. On the 10th day, something happened in the village that Doyeon had both been waiting for and feared. Daeho came to the smokehouse. Huge. Angry. He stood in the doorway, blocking the passage. He declared that Doyeon was dishonoring the traditions of the ancestors, that the fish should be dried in the wind, as the forefathers had done, that to spoil the noble fish with smoke was an insult to the spirit of the sea. Doyeon was crouching by the firebox. He didn't stand up. He looked up at Daeho. He pulled a single mackerel out of the smokehouse. He broke it in half and held out one half. He said nothing. Daeho stood there, staring at the fish, then at Doyeon, then back at the fish. His nostrils twitched. He snatched the fish from Doyeon's hand, took a bite, and chewed slowly, his expression unchanged. He finished his half. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He said the fish was lousy. He turned and walked away. But that evening, Taeseon saw Daeho standing on the shore, examining the crevice where Doyeon had set his traps. He stood there for a long time, alone, thinking about something. On the 12th day, Doyeon decided it was time to head to the market. He had 40 smoked mackerels and 20 salted horse mackerels. Yuna said the nearest market was in Namhae, half a day's walk, or 3 hours if there was a boat, but they only had small boats, and you couldn't reach Namhae by sea in them. Doyeon looked at his fish, at the village, at the people who, for the first time in months, didn't look like the living dead, and he made up his mind. He would carry the fish himself, on foot, half a day there, half a day back, with the fish in a basket on his back. Yuna said she would go with him. She didn't offer, she just said it, so it wasn't up for discussion. Taeseon volunteered as well. Doyeon left Junho and Eunbi to watch over the traps and the smokehouse. Before dawn, 3 figures set out from the village along the trail through the hills. Each carried a basket of fish on their back. Doyeon walked and thought. The market was his first contact with the outside world, the first time his fish would meet the eyes of strangers. If they liked it, there would be buyers. If there were buyers, there would be money. With money, he could buy tools, rope, iron for hooks, maybe even a boat, a real one, not a tub, but a boat. He didn't know yet that this market would be the beginning of everything, and the beginning of problems he couldn't foresee. Namhae overwhelmed Doyeon. After 10 days in a quiet, dying village, the city assaulted all his senses at once. Noise, shouts, smells. The harbor was crammed with boats, ranging from small rowboats to two-masted merchant barges. People in clothes that differed from the village rags as much as heaven differs from earth. Bright sashes, embroidered jackets. Some had strings of dried scales hanging around their necks. Money, silver mackerel scales, Haegyong currency. Doyeon had never held it in his hands. The market stretched along a long street by the waterfront. Stalls made of planks, canopies of canvas, and fish. Lots of fish. But Doyeon wasn't looking like a customer. He was looking like an ichthyologist. And he saw problems. The fish on the stalls were lying out in the heat, not in the shade, not on ice. Some of the carcasses had already darkened around the edges. The blood hadn't been drained. The gallbladders had surely burst during butchering in half of them. Flies landed freely. The vendors shooed them away with rags, but a minute later, the flies returned. Doyeon understood that in this world, the concept of fresh fish was limited to a single criterion. If it doesn't stink, it's fresh. If it stinks, it isn't. Between these 2 points lay a whole world of subtleties that no one here knew about. Yuna led them to a quiet corner of the market, a small patch of space between the stall of an old man selling seaweed and the wall of a port warehouse. They spread out a mat. Doyeon laid out the fish, smoked mackerel, 20 of them, golden, glistening with a thin layer of fat. Next to them, salted horse mackerel wrapped in leaves. The scent from their corner wafted through the market, smoky, slightly sweet, and rich. For the first 10 minutes, no one approached. Vendors from neighboring stalls glanced over with interest, but that was all. Shoppers walked right by. Then a woman approached. She was plump, with a basket slung over her hip. She sniffed the mackerel. She frowned. She asked what kind of fish it was and why it was that color. Doyeon explained. The fish was smoked over alder wood. It could be stored for a week without losing its flavor. The woman looked at him as if he were claiming that stones could fly. Fish doesn't last a week. Every child in Haegyong knew that. Doyeon broke off a piece from one of the fish. He held it out. The woman took it cautiously. She put it in her mouth. She chewed. Her eyes changed. Doyeon had seen this hundreds of times, at exhibitions, at conferences, at tastings in the port of Busan. That moment when a person expects one thing but gets another, something better. The woman swallowed. She looked at the fish. She looked at Doyeon. She asked how much. Yuna named the price, 2 scales apiece. Doyeon didn't know if that was a lot or a little. Yuna knew. Regular fresh mackerel cost 1 scale. Smoked mackerel keeps twice as long and tastes better. 2 scales was a fair price. The woman paid for 4 and left. Half an hour later, she returned with 3 friends. By noon, they had sold out. 40 smoked mackerels and 20 salted horse mackerels were sold. Yuna counted the scales. 80 scales per mackerel. 30 for a horse mackerel. 110 scales. Taeseon stood nearby and looked as if he'd seen a ghost. 110 scales. The entire village of Chhansu-ri didn't earn that much in a month. Doyeon took 10 scales from the pile and handed them to Yuna. He said they were for the village's needs. Yuna put them away without a word. He took 10 more. He turned to Taeseon. He said he needed rope, lots of rope, good hemp rope, hooks, iron ones, different sizes, fabric for nets, if any was for sale, and tools. Any cutting tool was better than a stone. Taeseon nodded and walked off toward the market stalls. Doyeon and Yuna stayed behind. Yuna was putting the scales into a small bag. Doyeon looked out at the market, at the fish spoiling in the heat, at the merchants who didn't know the simplest storage techniques, at the people buying poor quality products simply because they hadn't seen anything else. And he thought there was a lot to be done here, dangerously much, because money attracts attention, and in Haegyong, attention is a thing that can kill. He turned out to be right. Attention came faster than he'd expected. When Taeseon returned with his purchases, a man approached their empty spot. Short, Hu, wearing a dark jacket with a silver clasp shaped like a fish scale. His eyes were quick and calculating. He introduced himself, saying his name was Kang Min, and that he was the junior manager of the Namhae trading yard. He asked which fisherman's guild Doyeon belonged to. Doyeon didn't understand the question, and that saved him. Yuna answered for him, quickly and calmly. She said they were from Chhansu-ri. They catch fish near the shore, not out at sea. The shore fee doesn't require a guild license. Kangmin looked at Yuna, then at the empty mat where the fish had been lying an hour ago. He nodded. He said that shore fishing was, of course, a different matter. But if they ever decided to go out to sea, they would need a license. And licenses are issued by the Silver Scale Guild. It's best to start off on the right foot with the guild. Then he left. Yuna remained silent until they had left the market. Then she turned to Doyeon and said that this man wasn't the administrator. He was an informant for the guild, and that the guild now knew about them. Doyeon asked what that meant. Yuna replied with a single word: trouble. The walk back to the village took 4 hours. Taeseon carried a bag of ropes and hooks. Yuna carried the tools. Doyeon carried a bag with the remaining scales and thought. The Silver Scale Guild. He'd heard that name before. Taeseon had mentioned it when he explained why his father was forbidden to fish beyond the Cape. The guild controlled all the fishing waters south of the capital. Their ships patrolled the fishing grounds. Their people were present at every major market. Fish either went through them or didn't get through at all. A monopoly. Doyeon knew that word well. He had seen how fishing monopolies operated in Japan and Korea. He had seen how large companies squeezed out small-scale fishermen. He had seen how fishing industries that had fed villages for hundreds of years had perished. There was one difference. In his world, monopolies operated through laws and courts. Here, they operated through harpoons. When they returned to Chhansu-ri, the sun was already setting. The village greeted them with the smell of smoke from the smokehouse. Junho and Eunbi had managed everything. The traps had been checked. Fresh fish hung in rows. The coals were smoldering steadily. Doyeon gave Yuna all the scales except for 5, which he kept for himself. Yuna asked why he needed 5. Doyeon replied that he wanted to buy something at the next market. Yuna didn't ask what exactly. She was starting to get used to the fact that this man always knew something the others didn't. That night, Doyeon couldn't sleep. He sat in the shed by the light of a torch and thought. His mind was working as if he were defending his dissertation. Only instead of an academic committee, he was faced with the task of survival. Facts. The village can catch fish. The village can smoke and salt them. The village can sell them. But the village cannot go out to sea without a license. And a license means the guild. And the guild doesn't want competitors. So another way is needed. A royal decree. Anyone who brings a steady catch to the capital throughout the winter will receive the right to their own dock. A dock is not a guild license. It is a royal privilege. It's above the guild. But to get it, he'd have to deliver the fish to the capital. And the capital is far away. And standing between the village and the capital is the Silver Scale Guild, which already knows he exists. Doyeon lay on his back. He closed his eyes. He thought that in his past life, his biggest problem had been meeting the grant deadline. Now the deadline was different. Winter. If the village didn't get back on its feet by spring, the guild would crush them simply because it could. So he had to work faster. Rope was the key to everything. Doyeon repeated this to himself every morning when he went down to the shore. In his past life, the fishing industry had rested on 3 pillars: gear, storage, and logistics. He could make fishing gear out of bamboo and rope. He'd already solved the storage problem with a smokehouse and salt. Logistics was still hampered by the lack of a boat. But first, the gear. Those venturi traps he set near the shore yielded a steady but limited catch. The tidal zone is shallow water. The big fish are farther out, at a depth of 5 to 10 meters, where nets are needed. Real nets. Doyeon taught his 4 students every day: Taeseon, Junho, Junho, and Eunbi. They would gather at the shed before dawn and weave until dark, taking breaks to check the traps. Knot by knot, row after row. Eunbi wove faster than anyone else. Her fingers moved so smoothly that Doyeon would sometimes stop and just watch. 2 weeks after he arrived in the village, they had their first full-fledged set net, 30 meters long, 2 meters high. The mesh size was 40 millimeters. Doyeon had calculated the size to catch horse mackerel and mackerel, which made up the bulk of the local catch. Setting up the net was simple. The bottom edge was weighted down with stones. The top was held up by floats made of dried bamboo. It was stretched between 2 stakes driven into the bottom in shallow water. The fish swam along the shore with the current and ran into the wall of the net. They tried to get through. Their gills got caught in the mesh. The first day with the net yielded 70 kilograms. Taeseon sat on the shore next to a pile of silvery fish and said nothing. Doyeon could see that the man was trying to say something, but couldn't. Then, Taeseon stood and walked away. He returned an hour later with his mother, a small, frail woman who, according to Taeseon, could barely stand. She stood there looking at the fish. Then she looked at Doyeon. She bowed to him, almost touching the ground. Doyeon tried to help her up, but she wouldn't let him. She stood there, hunched over, crying into the sand. Taeseon was crying too. Junho turned away toward the sea. Doyeon stood there, not knowing what to do with his hands. In his past life, gratitude was expressed through grants and reviews. Here, a woman was kneeling in the wet sand because her children would be well fed for the first time in 6 months. It was more than he could bear. He put his hand on her shoulder and told her she didn't need to do this, that he was just fishing. The woman looked up and replied that he wasn't just fishing. He restored her son's eyesight. Because before that, Taeseon had stared at the floor every day, and she'd been afraid that one day he'd head out to sea and never come back. Doyeon said nothing, because there was nothing to say. As the catch increased, a new problem arose. 1 smokehouse wasn't enough. 20 fish at a time was the maximum. But now they were catching 70 to 80 kilograms a day. Half of it was still going bad. Doyeon needed to scale things up. He called for the village elder. The old man came, still as stooped as ever, still with the same fierce gaze. But now he was listening. Doyeon said the village needed a second smokehouse, a big one, and an open-air drying rack for air-dried fish, and a cellar for storage. 3 buildings. That would take manpower, a lot of manpower, the whole village. The village elder was silent for a long time. Then he asked why he needed all this. Why would a vagabond who had been washed ashore 2 weeks ago want to rebuild someone else's village? Doyeon answered simply, because he couldn't build anything on his own. He needed the village, and the village needed fish. It was that simple. The village head looked at him, scrutinizingly, the way a fisherman looks at an unfamiliar current, trying to figure out where it's taking him. Then he turned and walked away. The next morning, people came to Doyeon's shed. Not 4, 14, men and women. Among them was grandmother Volka, who 2 weeks ago had called him a sorcerer. She came with a shovel. Among them was Taeseon's mother. She came with a basket of clay. Doyeon stood in the doorway of the shed and watched them. Then he told them they needed to dig. Dig a lot. And they began. They dug the cellar for 5 days. A deep one, 2 human heights. They lined the walls with stone. Doyeon insisted on double walls with a layer of dry sawdust in between. Insulation. Sawdust doesn't conduct heat. The air between the walls acts like a thermos. No one knew the word thermos. Doyeon stopped trying to explain and just demonstrated. They built the cellar's roof out of thick logs covered with earth. Dark, cold. Inside, the temperature was 10 degrees lower than outside. Doyeon climbed down into the finished cellar and felt the cool air on his face. It worked. Fish could be stored here 3 times longer than on the surface. And in winter, when the temperature dropped even lower, the cellar would turn into a real refrigerator. They were building a second smokehouse at the same time, 3 times larger than the first. Doyeon calculated the draft. The height difference between the firebox and the upper chamber had to be at least 2 meters. That way, the smoke would flow evenly and not stagnate. Taeseon and Junho hauled stones. The women mixed clay for the joints. Eunbi supervised the teenagers as they cut poles for hanging the fish. Doyeon walked among them, making adjustments. The stone isn't right here. The gap is too wide here. This pole is too thin and will bend under the weight. Yuna stood nearby and took notes. She had developed a habit of writing down everything Doyeon said. Not on paper. There was no paper in Chhansu-ri. On smooth bamboo slats. She scratched out characters with a sharp stick. Doyeon asked why. Yuna replied that if he left or died tomorrow, the village needed to remember what he had shown them. It was the longest conversation they'd had in 2 weeks. The drying shed became their third project, a long canopy on posts with airy walls made of bamboo slats. The fish were hung on hooks and dried in the wind. The sea breeze is ideal for drying fish. Salty and steady. Doyeon showed them how to properly fillet the fish for drying, not along the rib bones, but across them. Unfold the carcass like a book. Rub in salt at the rate of 1 handful per fish the size of a palm. Hang them skin side up so the fat drains downward and doesn't drip onto the meat. 3 weeks after Doyeon's arrival, the village of Chhansu-ri had 8 Ventera traps on the shore. 1 set net in shallow water. 2 smokehouses, a drying shed for 40 fish, a double-walled cellar, salt pans yielding 1 kilogram of salt per day, and a team of 14 people who knew how to gut fish without rupturing the gallbladder. The catch stabilized at 70 to 90 kilograms per day. Half went to feed the village. A quarter was smoked and salted for sale. A quarter went into the cellar for storage. For the first time in all the years Doyeon had lived here, he saw children running, not walking, not sitting by the walls, running, with shrieks and laughter. They now had the strength to be children. The girl who used to gnaw on bark now came to the shed every morning. She'd bring him a roasted root or a handful of berries, then she'd run off. She never said a word to him, but she came every day. Doyeon didn't know her name. He asked Yuna. Yuna replied that the girl's name was Nayeon and that she had no parents. She lived with her grandmother, Volhi. Doyeon nodded. That evening, he took a bowl of fish broth to Volhi's house. Thick, rich, made from mackerel heads and bones that no one else had used. Broth that provides protein and calcium and warms you from the inside. Volhi took the bowl. She looked at Doyeon, and for the first time, she didn't call him a sorcerer. She called him son. On the 22nd day, Doyeon went to the Nama, this time with double the shipment. 80 pieces of smoked mackerel, 40 salted horse mackerel, and something new, 10 bundles of dried fish, 5 pieces in each, tied with bamboo ribbon. They sold everything in 3 hours, 230 scales. Yuna counted them twice. Taeseon sat nearby, shaking his head. On the way back, Doyeon carried a bag of purchases, iron hooks, 3 skeins of rope, a roll of coarse cloth, 2 real knives, and 1 item for which he had specifically sought out a blacksmith at the market, a small knife with a short, curved blade, custom made. He paid 15 scales for it, more than for all the other purchases combined. Yuna didn't know about it. That evening, after everyone had gone their separate ways, Doyeon found Yuna by the smokehouse. She was checking the fish, just like every evening. Doyeon walked over and handed her the knife. Yuna took it. She looked at the blade. She frowned. She turned it over in her hand. She tested the grip. The blade fit her left hand like a glove. The curve started at the wrist, not the forearm. The sharpening angle was mirror reversed. It was a left-handed knife. A knife specifically for someone who had spent her whole life cutting with a standard right-handed knife and cutting her knuckles until they bled. Yuna stared silently at the knife, then at Doyeon, then back at the knife. She didn't say a word. She turned and quickly walked behind the house. Doyeon remained alone by the smokehouse. He checked the coals. He tossed in some wood chips. Smoke rose in a steady stream. It smelled of alder and salt. He thought about how, in his past life, it had never occurred to him that a knife could mean so much. An hour later, Yuna returned. Her eyes were red. Her face was calm. She sat down next to him by the fire. For the first time, she was right beside him, not at a distance. And she said one thing. She said that his smokehouse was drawing unevenly, and that the smoke was drifting more to the left. Doyeon looked. She was right. He smiled. It was their first real work conversation. Minseo Han appeared on the 26th day. Hayeon remembered it clearly because it was the first time it had rained that day. Cold autumn rain that pelted the roofs like handfuls of small stones. The village was huddled indoors. The smokehouse was running. Eunbi was tending the fire wrapped in a straw mat. Doyeon was repairing traps in the shed when he heard Taeseon's voice. Taeseon was calling him outside. At the entrance to the village stood a group of people, about 10 of them, soaked to the bone, thin. Among them were women carrying children in their arms, an old man with a cane, and one girl who stood at the front of the group, looking straight at Doyeon. Small, slender as a bamboo pole. Her hair was wet and disheveled, matted to her face. Her clothes were torn, but her eyes were alive, bright, angry with hunger, but not broken. The village head went out to meet them. He asked who they were and where they were from. The girl answered for everyone. She said they were from Tonpori, a village 2 hours' walk to the east. Their village had died. The last fisherman had left for Namhae to look for work. Only the old and the children remained. They'd heard that there was fish in Chhansu-ri, that people were being fed here, that a man lived here who knew how to pull fish out of the rocks. And so they came. The village head turned to Doyeon. His gaze spoke volumes without words. 10 extra mouths to feed. The village had only just begun to breathe again. Feeding strangers meant going hungry once more. Doyeon looked at the girl, at the old man behind her, at the woman with the child who wasn't crying. Children who are starving stop crying. Doyeon knew this from documentaries. Now he was seeing it firsthand. He told the village head that he would feed them from his own share. The village head shrugged and walked away. That meant he agreed. Doyeon led the people to the barn. He stoked the fire to make it bigger. He took out a supply of smoked fish from the cellar. He cooked a broth from the fish heads and spines, thick, hot. He added the seaweed he'd gathered and set aside. He ladled it into bowls. 10 people ate in silence, hungrily, burning their tongues. The child in the woman's arms woke up from the smell of food and began to cry. For the first time in a long while. It was a good sign. The girl ate last. When everyone had finished, she set her empty bowl on the ground and looked at Doyeon. She said her name was Minseo Han, that she was 19, that she was an orphan at the temple in Tonpori, that she could read and write, and that she wouldn't leave. Doyeon asked why. Minseo replied that she wanted to learn to do what he did, because she'd been useless her whole life, and she was tired of it. Doyeon looked at her hands, small, with slender fingers, perfect for weaving nets. He said they'd start tomorrow. Minseo turned out to be what they called a sponge on the trawlers, a person who absorbs information on the first try and never forgets it. Doyeon showed her how to tie a sheet end knot once. She got it right on her third try. He showed her how to determine the direction of the current by the ripples on the water. She memorized it that very same day. On the third day after her arrival, Minseo was already teaching the children from Seonpo-ri how to tie simple rope loops for traps. She had developed a habit. Every evening, she would sit by the campfire with a smooth bamboo board and a sharp stick, and write down everything she had heard from Doyeon that day. Unlike Yuna, who recorded instructions and diagrams, Minseo wrote down words, phrases that Doyeon would casually drop in the course of conversation and that seemed ordinary to him. Once, he was explaining to Taeseon why fish smell the way they do. He said that fish meat contains a substance that, when it decomposes, turns into trimethylamine. That's what gives fish that pungent, rotten smell. If you drain the blood immediately after catching the fish, the amount of this substance is cut in half, and the fish stays fresh longer. Taeseon nodded and said he understood. Doyeon could tell he didn't really get it, but he was doing it right, and that was what mattered. That evening, Minseo showed him her little board. Written on it was, "Fish smell because a little spirit named trimethylamine. If you bleed it out quickly, the spirit leaves with the blood and the fish doesn't get angry." Doyeon read it and didn't know whether to cry or laugh. Minseo asked if she had understood it correctly. Doyeon replied that, overall, the gist was correct. Minseo nodded seriously and said she would name her notebook "The Book of the Teacher's Wise Words." Doyeon asked her not to call him teacher. Minseo didn't listen. By the end of Doyeon's first month in Chhansu-ri, the village had changed. Not on the outside. The houses were still crooked. The roofs still leaked. The clothes were still made of burlap. But the people moved differently. Faster. More confidently. In the morning, the men went to the shore to check the traps and nets. The women worked in the smokehouse and drying shed. The teenagers, led by Eunbi and now Minseo, wove nets and cut beach for new traps. The children gathered mussels and crabs at low tide. Even grandmother Wolhee found something to do. She sat by the salt pans and monitored the evaporation. Whenever one of the children tried to steal a salt crystal, she would tap their fingers with a stick and say that salt wasn't a toy, but the village's future. Doyeon heard this and thought that grandmother Wolhee understood economics better than some of the professors he knew in Busan. Daeho was still keeping to himself, but Doyeon noticed. Daeho was no longer breaking the traps. He was no longer standing on the hill with his arms crossed. Instead, every morning he would go out to the shore alone. He fished the old-fashioned way, with a fishing rod, horsehair line, a bone hook. And every morning he returned with 5 or 6 fish. Meanwhile, Doyeon's traps yielded 80 kilograms. Daeho didn't mention it, but his shoulders slumped lower and lower with each passing day. Doyeon saw this and knew he had to tread carefully. The pride of a broken man is like a bomb. One wrong move and it will explode. On the 30th day, Doyeon did what he'd been planning since the first week. He went to see Daeho, alone, with no witnesses. He found him on the shore. Daeho was sitting on a rock, staring out at the sea. His fishing rod lay nearby. Doyeon sat down 5 steps away, no closer. He remained silent. Daeho was silent too. They sat like that for about 10 minutes, 2 men on the rocks by the water. Then Doyeon spoke. He said he needed help. Daeho didn't turn around. Doyeon continued. He said that traps and nets were good for shallow water, but the big fish were farther out, where you needed a boat, and a man who knew these waters, who had fished here his whole life, who felt the sea not with his head, but with his body. No book could give that kind of knowledge, and Doyeon didn't have any books, just his head. Daeho was silent. Then he asked if Doyeon was making fun of him. Doyeon replied that he wasn't, that he really did need someone to show him the bottom of the cove, where the rocks were, where the sand was, where the current changed. Because Doyeon could read the water from above, but didn't know what lay beneath it. And Daeho knew. Daeho remained silent for another 5 minutes. Then he stood up. He picked up his fishing rod, and he said that tomorrow morning he'd go out in a boat, and if Doyeon wasn't a coward, he could come with him. Doyeon nodded. The next morning, they set out to sea in Daeho's small, flat-bottomed boat, a 3-step boat. Doyeon sat at the stern and watched the water. Daeho rowed, in silence. They circumnavigated the bay in 3 hours. Daeho pointed things out. Rocks here, a deep spot here. There's always a current from the south here. The bottom is sandy here, and flounder gather here in winter. His father once found a school of tuna here, but that was 20 years ago, and the tuna haven't returned since. Doyeon listened and nodded, and thought. Rocks on the bottom, a pit with a southern current, a sandy patch. It all came together into a map, not on paper, in his head. When they returned to shore, Doyeon told Daeho that he knew where to set the net to catch flounder. Lots of flounder. Daeho said you can't catch flounder with a net. Doyeon replied that you can if you know how. 2 days later, they set a bottom net in the sandy patch that Daeho had pointed out. The net lay on the seabed, weighted down with stones. The flounder swim along the sand and bump into the net. They try to get around it. They get stuck. In the morning, Daeho pulled the net out by himself. Doyeon waited on the shore. Daeho approached him with an expression Doyeon couldn't read. Then, without a word, he dumped 14 flounders out of the boat. Each was the size of 2 palms. Plump, fat, winter flounder. The most expensive fish at the Namhae market. Daeho stood over this mountain of fish, breathing heavily. Not from fatigue, from something else. Then he said one word. He said it was okay. And he went back to his place. From that day on, Daeho became part of the team. He didn't apologize for the broken traps. Doyeon didn't bring it up. Some things don't need words. The second month began with cold weather. The wind from the north carried the scent of ice. The sea darkened. The waves grew short and fierce. Winter in Haegyeong was no joke. Doyeon knew this from the water temperature, which had dropped by about 7 degrees to the touch over the course of a week. On the trawlers in the Bering Sea, he'd worked in -20. It was warmer here, but the people were dressed more poorly. Burlap doesn't hold the heat. The first frosts hit on the 35th day. In the morning, the puddles near the houses were covered with a thin crust of ice. The children huddled against the walls. 3 of the little ones in Minsu's group had started coughing. Doyeon examined them. He wasn't a doctor, but on the trawler, he'd learned to tell a cold from pneumonia by the sound of their breathing. It was just a cold, for now, but if they weren't kept warm and fed hot food, it would get worse. He made some broth. Not your usual broth. A thick stock made from mackerel heads and spines. He added seaweed to it, along with the cod liver he'd been saving specifically for this. Cod liver is a source of iron and vitamin D. For emaciated children, it's medicine. Doyeon poured the broth into bowls and personally made sure every child drank it all. Minsu sat nearby and took notes. Her notepad filled to the brim, so Doyeon gave her a new stack. Minsu wrote down the recipe for the broth. In her version, it went like this. Take the fish head and bones and simmer them for a long time until the water turns white. The white water is the fish's power that has transferred into the soup. Add cod liver because warmth lives within it. The teacher said that this warmth is called vitamin D. Doyeon read it and decided that for practical purposes, this was enough. The cold brought one advantage. The double-walled cellar now functioned almost like a refrigerator. The fish inside didn't spoil for 5 or 6 days. This changed everything. Before, they could store a supply for 2 or 3 days. Now, for a week. They could stockpile fish for large shipments to the market. They could build up a reserve in case of a storm when it was dangerous to go ashore. Doyeon began to calculate. The daily catch was 80 to 90 kilograms. Of that, 30 for the village's food supply, including the refugees from Tompori, 20 for smoking, 20 for salting and drying, 20 stored fresh in the cellar, a trip to the market in Namhae every 10 days. Proceeds from the last trip, 310 scales. Growth. Yuna kept track of everything on bamboo tablets. Income, expenses, inventory. She did this on her own, without Doyeon asking her to. She just started keeping track, that's all. Doyeon saw her tablets and stopped. Yuna had created an accounting system. Primitive, but logical. Columns, rows, units of measurement. She had never studied accounting. She invented it herself because she saw that numbers were important. Doyeon told her that was very good. Yuna shrugged and replied that someone had to keep track of the numbers while he was busy with the fish. On the 40th day, Doyeon gathered everyone together. Taeseon, Junho, Daeho, Eunbi, Minseo, and Yuna. 14 workers, as well as the village head, whom he had personally summoned. They sat down in the large smokehouse because it was the warmest place in the village. Doyeon said they needed to talk about the future. Winter was just beginning. In 2 months, it would be at its coldest. The sea would become dangerous. Storms would become more frequent. The catch would decline. But if they built up a sufficient stockpile now, they would get through the winter without any losses. To do that, they needed to increase their capacity. More nets, more traps, and most importantly, they needed a boat. A real boat. Not Daeho's flat-bottomed boat, but a boat that could take them past the cape to where the big fish were. Horse mackerel and mackerel were good, but tuna is 10 times more expensive, and winter tuna is the fattest. Silence. The village head spoke first. He reminded them of the law. Boats longer than 3 paces are prohibited for fishermen. Doyeon replied that he knew, but he asked who would be checking. Namhae is far away. The capital is even farther, and the sea doesn't ask for documents. The village head shook his head. He said the guild would check. They have patrol boats. If they spot an illegal boat, they'll seize it and burn it, and the fishermen will be thrown into debt slavery. Doyeon was silent for a moment. Then he asked, what if the boat isn't a fishing boat? What if it's a cargo boat for transporting goods? Not fish, but smoked products. A product isn't a catch. A product is merchandise. Merchandise can be transported. The village head narrowed his eyes. Yuna, standing next to Doyeon, leaned forward slightly. She was the first to understand. The law prohibits wet fishermen from catching fish on the open sea, but the law doesn't prohibit transporting merchandise by sea, because there had never been such merchandise before. Smoked and salted fish aren't a catch. They're processed products. A loophole. A small one. A legal one. But a loophole nonetheless. The village head thought for a long time. Then he said he didn't know if it would work. But they could build the boat, if they kept it quiet, if they did it discreetly. Doyeon nodded. On the 45th day, in a ravine behind the village where nothing could be seen from the sea, they began building the boat. Doyeon sketched on the ground. 7 paces long, twice the permitted length, a wide hull for stability, a flat bottom for shallow water, and a mast. 1 mast, with a gaff sail. A gaff sail is what allows you to sail against the wind. All the boats in Haegyong had square sails. They could only sail downwind. If the wind was against you, row or wait. A gaff sail changed the rules. A boat with a gaff sail could go anywhere in any wind. It was an advantage that no one here knew about. Daeho looked at the drawing and couldn't believe it. He said, "You don't set a sail like that. That the wind would tear the fabric, that the mast would break." Doyeon explained, "The angle of the sail to the wind, the center of lateral resistance, heel and ballast. Daeho listened, frowning. Then he said he'd give it a try. But if the boat capsized on the launch, Doyeon would row back to shore himself. They built it for 3 weeks. Daeho cut the frames. Taeseon and Junho bent the planking by steaming them over a fire. Doyeon kept an eye on the hull's geometry. He checked every plank, every seam. Yuna brought fabric for the sail, coarse but sturdy. She bought it at the market with money from their last sale. Minseo sewed the sail together with Eunbi. The 2 girls sat in the shed, threading the needle through the heavy fabric hour after hour. Both of their fingers were pricked until they bled. But the sail turned out well, triangular, reinforced along the edges. Doyeon examined it and said it was good. Minseo beamed as if she'd been awarded a medal. On the 50th day, the boat was ready. They launched it at night, without lights, quietly. 12 men dragged the hull from the ravine to the water on log rollers. The boat touched the water and rocked. It didn't capsize. Doyeon stood knee-deep in the cold water, holding the side of the boat. Daeho stood nearby. He looked at the boat. He looked at Doyeon. He said it might not capsize. They hoisted the sail in the morning, at dawn, when the onshore wind was blowing from the land out to sea. A square sail is useless in such a wind. The gaff sail caught it like an open palm. The boat surged forward. Daeho at the helm, Doyeon at the sheet. The boat was moving, against the wind, cutting through the waves with its bow. Fast, much faster than any flat-bottomed boat in the bay. Daeho was silent, his hands on the tiller, his eyes wide open. He felt the boat with his whole body, and he liked what he felt. They returned an hour later. The whole village was standing on the shore. They watched in silence. The boat was the biggest thing they'd ever seen in the hands of the wet men. It was illegal. It was dangerous. And it was beautiful. Doyeon jumped onto the sand. Yuna walked up to him. She looked at the boat, then at him. She said it needed a name. Doyeon thought for a moment. Then he said the boat would be called First Step. Yuna snorted. She said it was a silly name, but her eyes were warm. The boat changed the game. With it, Doyeon could set his nets farther from shore, at depths where the fish were too deep to reach with traps. Daeho went out every morning, alone, on First Step, with the bottom nets and longlines that Doyeon had taught him to set. Longline fishing involves a long rope with hooks on leaders spaced every 2 meters. 100 hooks on a single line. The bait was mackerel guts. The line was set at depth and left overnight. In the morning, Daeho would haul it in and bring back whatever he'd caught. Sea bass, eel, large flounder, once a small shark. Doyeon examined the shark. A catfish, or something very similar to a catfish. 1 meter 20 long. The meat was tough, but the liver, shark liver is pure fat, rich in vitamins. In Japan, shark fat was sold in pharmacies for a lot of money. Doyeon rendered the liver over low heat. He ended up with 2 liters of clear oil. He took it to the old man who lived on the outskirts of the village and whom everyone called Grandpa Pon. Grandpa Pon's joints ached so badly that he couldn't make a fist. Doyeon told him to rub his hands with shark fat in the morning and at night. Grandpa Pon looked at him suspiciously, but took the fat. A week later, Grandpa Pon came to Doyeon's shed. Without a word, he set a pair of boots in front of him. Old but sturdy, repaired, resoled with new oxhide soles. He said his hands hurt less, and he left. Doyeon put on the boots. For the first time in 2 months, his feet were warm. Little things. Everything hinged on little things. A knife for Yuna, broth for the children, fat for the old man's joints. Every gesture was returned, not immediately, not for show. Quietly, like a baked root on the threshold. a bundle of bamboo by the wall, a pair of boots. Doyeon was beginning to understand how the economy of trust worked in this world, not through contracts and signatures, through a bowl of soup and a pair of dry boots. On the 55th day, he set off for the market in Namhae with his largest shipment yet: 120 smoked mackerels, 60 salted horse mackerels, 30 bundles of dried fish, and a new product, fish sauce. Doyeon had spent 10 days making it. He covered the small fish, which weren't worth smoking, with salt in a 1:3 ratio. He placed them in a clay pot, covered it, and left it in the sun. He stirred it every day. The fish decomposed, dissolving into the salt. After 10 days, a dark brown liquid had accumulated at the bottom of the pot. Doyeon strained it through a cloth. He tasted it. Salty, deep, with that very umami flavor that, in his past life as a chef, they called the fifth taste. Fish sauce, a staple ingredient in half the cuisines of Southeast Asia. It didn't exist here. Here, fish was eaten boiled, raw, or, at best, air-dried. The idea that fish could become a liquid seasoning was, to the locals, roughly equivalent to the idea that a stone could become bread. Doyeon poured the sauce into 10 small clay bottles he'd bought at the previous market. At the market in Namhae, he set the bottles out separately. He let the first person who approached try some. It was a female cook from a portside eatery. She dipped her finger. She licked it. She froze. She dipped it again. She turned to Doyeon and asked how much he wanted for the whole lot. Doyeon named his price, 15 scales per bottle. The cook didn't haggle. She bought all 10. 150 scales for 10 bottles of liquid that had been waste just a week ago. Yuna stood nearby, looking at the scales in her palm. Then she looked at Doyeon. There was something new in her eyes. Not surprise. She had already stopped being surprised. Something else. Perhaps the beginning of an understanding of who this man really was. The day's total earnings came to 480 scales. Yuna wrote the number on a small board and underlined it twice. On the way back, they weren't carrying bags of groceries like they used to. They were sailing. On the first step, Daeho at the helm, Yuna at the bow, Taeseon and Doyeon with the cargo in the middle. The boat glided smoothly. The sail caught the crosswind and pulled them along the shore toward home. The journey that used to take half a day on foot now took 2 hours by boat. Daeho steered in silence, but sometimes he would stroke the tiller with his hand, as if it were a living creature. This man had grown to love this boat. Doyeon saw it and understood. For a fisherman, a boat isn't just a means of transportation. It's a part of his body. They returned to the village before dark, for the first time. Market days used to end with a nighttime trek along dark trails. Now they returned with the sunrise. A small victory. But Doyeon remembered Yuna's words. The guild knew about them, and the guild's silence troubled him more than any threat. Silence meant they were watching, assessing, deciding, waiting for the right moment. On the 60th day, the moment came. Doyeon returned from his morning rounds of the traps and saw a stranger by the village well. A man in his 40s, well-dressed, clean, leather boots. On his belt, a knife in a sheath with a silver fish on the hilt, the emblem of the Silver Scale Guild. The man was drinking water from the well and talking to the village elder, calmly, smiling. The elder wasn't smiling. Doyeon approached. The man turned toward him. His smile widened. He introduced himself. He said his name was Serin Chon and that he was the regional representative of the Silver Scale Guild for the southern villages. He said rumors had reached the guild about a remarkable craftsman from Chhansu-ri who makes extraordinary fish. The guild is impressed. The guild would like to propose a partnership. Doyeon listened. Serin spoke, at length, smoothly. Every word was polished like a seashell. The gist of the proposal was simple. Doyeon would join the guild as a junior artisan. He would receive a fishing license. He would receive protection. He would gain access to the markets of all the islands. In return, the guild would take 60% of his catch, and all his technologies would become the property of the guild. Doyeon listened and nodded. Then he asked one thing. He asked what would happen to the village. Taeseon smiled and replied that a village is a village. The guild works with craftsmen, not with villages. Doyeon could move to Namhae. He'd get a house, a workshop, people to work with. The village would remain as it is. Doyeon looked at Taeseon, then at the village head behind him, at the faces of the people peering out from behind the walls of their houses, at Taeseon, who stood by the smokehouse with his fists clenched, at Minseo, who was pressing her bamboo slats to her chest, at Yoon, who stood by the well with a stony expression. He replied that he needed to think it over. Taeseon nodded. He said, "Of course." He said the guild wasn't in a hurry, but he reminded him that winter was long and the sea was cold, and that some offers had a deadline. Then he left, down the path through the hills, without looking back. That evening, Doyeon sat in the smokehouse with Yuna. They were silent. The fire crackled. Smoke curled upward. Yuna spoke first. She said that if he agreed, she would understand. That it was a good offer, a license, protection, money. That she wouldn't blame him. Doyeon looked at her. He asked what made her think he'd agree. Yuna replied that everyone agrees. Always. The guild makes an offer. And everyone agrees because there's never a second offer. There's only the harpoon. Doyeon was silent for a moment. Then he said he wouldn't agree. Yuna asked why. Doyeon replied that it was because a village wasn't something you could throw away for a license. Yuna looked at him for a long time. In the light of the fire, her face looked softer than usual. Then she said he was a fool, and that she was glad he was a fool, and she left. But at the threshold, she turned around and said that tomorrow morning he needed to fix the north wall of the smokehouse because the crack had gotten bigger and the draft was off again. Doyeon nodded. They both knew it wasn't about the wall. 10 days of silence passed after his refusal. Then the blow came. Not to the forehead, from the side, just as Yuna had warned. Doyeon woke up to a scream, a nighttime scream, sharp, Eunbi's voice. He bolted out of the shed barefoot. He ran toward the smokehouse. Even before he saw it, he knew from the smell. It was burning, not with alder smoke. It was burning for real, an open fire. The smokehouse was ablaze. The big one, the one the whole village had spent 3 weeks building. The roof had already collapsed inward. The walls were cracking from the heat. Eunbi stood nearby, screaming. She was on the night shift. She'd stepped away for 10 minutes to get water from the well. When she returned, the smokehouse was already on fire. Doyeon ran over. The heat was so intense that he couldn't get any closer than 5 steps. The fish were inside. The entire batch for tomorrow's market. 60 smoked mackerel. All burned. People were running out of their houses. Taeseon with a bucket. Junho with a wet mat. It was useless. Stone walls don't burn. But everything made of wood inside was ablaze. Poles, hanging rods, a supply of wood chips, the door. By morning, all that remained of the large smokehouse was a charred box. The walls were still standing. Everything else was charcoal. Doyeon walked around, searching. He found what he was looking for by the back wall. A rag, soaked in something oily. Lamp oil. Someone had brought the rag, soaked it in oil, and set it alight at the base of the wall where the supply of wood chips lay. The wood chips flared up. After that, the fire took care of everything on its own. Arson. Doyeon stood with the rag in his hand, staring at the charred smokehouse. His hands didn't tremble. Inside, there was emptiness, a cold, calm realization. He knew this would happen. Yuna had warned him. The guild doesn't make a second offer. The guild sets an example. The village head was shaking, not from the cold, from fear. He paced between the houses, repeating that he'd known it all along, that the vagrant had brought trouble upon them, that they should have driven him out on the very first day. Taeseon stood next to Doyeon and said nothing. His face was ashen. Junho sat on the ground, staring at a single point. Minseo was crying, quietly, clutching the wooden slats with her notes to her chest. Yuna was the last to arrive. She looked at the smokehouse, at the rag in Doyeon's hands, at the village head who was trembling. Then she turned toward the village and said one sentence. She said that, enough of the whining. It was time to rebuild. Silence. The village head fell silent. Everyone fell silent. Yuna looked at Doyeon. There was no fear in her eyes. There was anger. Cold. Determined. The anger of a person who was used to having things taken from them and who had learned to hold their head high after every blow. Doyeon nodded. They began rebuilding that very day. The small smokehouse was operational. The first one. The old one. Doyeon moved all production there. It was cramped, 1/3 the capacity, but it was better than nothing. They rebuilt the large smokehouse in 10 days, faster than the first time because the walls were still standing. All they needed were the support poles, a new door, and a roof. Daeho worked harder than anyone else, silently, from morning till night. He hauled stones for the new roof all by himself. No one asked him to. He just showed up and started working. On the 3rd day after the fire, Doyeon set up night watch shifts, 2 people every night. Taeseon and Junho took turns with Daeho and 2 men from Tompori, armed with sticks and knives. For the first time, Doyeon thought about things that hadn't existed in his past life. About the fact that the smokehouse needed a guard, that the boat needed a lock on its chain, that at night he had to sleep with one eye open. It was a new skill, unpleasant, necessary. On the 65th day, something happened that Doyeon hadn't planned for. Serin Chon came to him. He didn't know who she was. He saw a strange woman on the path to the village, young, in a blue robe with a wave symbol on her shoulder, pale skin, slender hands that had never known hard labor. She walked along the muddy path so carefully, as if afraid of getting her hem dirty. Walking beside her was a novice with a knapsack on his back. Yuna saw her first. She turned pale. She whispered to Doyeon that she was a priestess from the temple, from that very temple on Sodo Island. Doyeon asked what that meant. Yuna replied that it meant someone had reported them to the temple. The priestesses believe the sea is sacred, that fish are a gift from the spirits, that fishing in a way not bequeathed by the ancestors is blasphemy. And if the priestess decides that Doyeon is offending the spirits, she can ask the king to have him arrested. Doyeon watched the approaching figure in blue. He thought quickly. The guild was on the left. The temple was on the right. The law was above. And he was in the middle, in a village of 40 houses with a smokehouse that had just been rebuilt after being set on fire. What a wonderful situation. Serin walked up to the well. She asked for water. She drank carefully. She wiped her lips with her sleeve. Then she looked at Doyeon and introduced herself. She said she was the junior priestess of the Sodo temple. She had been sent to investigate reports of unusual catches in the village of Chhansu-ri. Doyeon nodded. He asked who had reported it. Serin replied that it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was here, and that she needed to observe his methods to determine whether they violated the sacred order. Doyeon looked at her, then at Yoon, who was standing behind him with a frozen expression, then back at Serin. And he did something no one expected. He asked if she knew why the fish had left the shores of Haegyong. Serin blinked. She replied that the fish had left because the spirits of the sea were angry. Doyeon asked what they were angry about. Serin replied that it was because of people's greed. Doyeon nodded. He said she was right, half right. People had indeed been greedy. They'd caught too many young fish. They hadn't let the fish spawn. They'd swept the spawning grounds with fine mesh nets. But there was something else. The water temperature. It had risen. Just a little, maybe by 1 or 2 degrees. For a human, that's nothing. For fish, it's a catastrophe. The fish are heading to where the water is colder, deeper, further away. This isn't the wrath of the spirits. It's the sea's pain. The sea is in pain, and the fish are fleeing from that pain. Serin listened. Her expression changed. Not anger, not distrust. Something else. Interest. The genuine, living interest of a person hearing for the first time an explanation that doesn't contradict what they believe, but rather deepens it. She asked how he knew this. Doyeon replied that he knew the sea. He'd studied it for a long time. Serin was silent for a moment. Then she said she would stay for a few days. She'd watch. She'd listen. She'd decide later. Doyeon agreed. Yuna exhaled behind him. But she didn't relax. Yuna never relaxed. The Silver Scale Guild set fire to the village's large smokehouse, destroying a shipment of fish destined for the market. The village rebuilt the smokehouse in 10 days. Doyeon set up night watch shifts. Serin Chon, a junior priestess of the Sodo temple, arrived to investigate the unusual catches. Doyeon diffused her concerns with an explanation about why the fish had disappeared, citing the concept of a sick sea. Serin stayed in the village for 7 days. The novice slept on a mat by the well. Serin was given a corner in Grandmother Wolhe's house. Grandmother grumbled, but you don't turn away a priestess. It's bad luck. Every morning, Serin went out and watched, in silence. She stood on the hill and watched as Doyeon checked the traps, as Taeseon and Junho hauled in the net, as Eunbi directed the teenagers as they wove, as Minseo ran back and forth among them, taking notes, how Yuna counted the fish and stacked them in baskets, how Daeho went out to the open water at the first step and returned with a net full of fish. Serin watched and didn't interfere. On the 3rd day, she went down to the shore. She approached Doyeon, who was sorting the catch on the rocks, large fish separately, small fish separately, damaged fish for sauce, whole fish for smoking. She asked why he wasn't taking them all, why he was setting the small ones aside. Doyeon explained, the small fish are juveniles. They haven't spawned yet. If we take them today, they won't be big tomorrow. Because the big fish were once small. It's a cycle. If you break it in one place, the whole thing will fall apart. Serin listened. Then she said it was similar to the law of return in the temple's teachings. The sea gives, but the sea also takes away. If you take more than you're supposed to, the sea will take it all back. Doyeon looked at her. He said yes, that's exactly right. Only he calls it sustainable fishing. Serin smiled slightly. She said his words were longer, but the meaning was the same. They talked on the shore for another hour. Doyeon talked about spawning grounds, about water temperature and oxygen, about how plankton depends on currents, fish depend on plankton, and people depend on fish. Everything is connected. One chain. Serin listened with a level of attention that Doyeon had never seen in any of his students. She wasn't just memorizing, she was understanding. She was connecting his words to her own knowledge. She was drawing parallels. Her faith wasn't being shaken by his science. It was growing. On the 4th day, Serin asked the question Doyeon had been waiting for. She asked who he really was. Where did he get to know things that no fisherman in Haegyong knew? Doyeon paused. They were sitting by the water. It was evening. The sunset painted the sea copper. He answered cautiously. He said he had come from far away, from a place where the sea is studied not through prayer but through observation, where people have been recording the behavior of fish and water for decades, where understanding is built from these records, not faith, understanding. But understanding and faith are not enemies. They are the two eyes of the same face. Close one and you lose depth. Serin was silent for a long time. The waves rustled across the sand. Then she said something strange. She said that in the archives of the Sodo temple, there were records of a man who had come 200 years ago, also from far away. He, too, possessed knowledge unknown in Haegyong. He brought gunpowder and new sails. The priestesses burned him. They called him a herald whose knowledge tears the fabric of the world. Doyeon froze. The skin on the back of his neck tightened. Serin looked at him, quietly, without threat, but with an understanding that was more terrifying than any threat. She knew. Not everything, but enough. Doyeon asked why she was telling him this. Serin replied that it was because that man, 200 years ago, had also fed people. He too had taught. He too had built. And they burned him anyway. Because the priestesses were afraid. She said she didn't want that to happen again. Doyeon looked at her, at the young woman in a blue robe with a wave symbol on her shoulder, at her face in the sunset light, at her hands folded in her lap, white, slender, hands that had spent their whole life in prayer and had never once held a knife. He asked what she wanted, not as a priestess, her, Serin, a person. Serin looked out at the sea. She was silent. Then she said she didn't know, that no one had ever asked, that since she was 6, she'd been taught to be the voice of the sea, but no one had ever asked what the voice itself wanted. Doyeon nodded. He didn't press her. He didn't try to comfort her. He just sat beside her. 2 people by the water, each with their own secret. On the 7th day, Serin got ready to leave. The novice was packing her knapsack. Serin approached Doyeon. She said she would write a report to the temple, that the methods of the fisherman from Chhansu-ri did not contradict the sacred order, that the sea had not been desecrated, that the village could carry on. Doyeon thanked her. Serin added that she would return. Soon. Not as an investigator, as a guest, if he didn't mind. Doyeon said he didn't mind. Serin turned and walked down the path. On the hill, she looked back. She looked at the village, at the smokehouse from which smoke was rising, at the people on the shore, at Doyeon, who was standing by the well watching her go. Then she continued on her way. Yuna was standing behind Doyeon. He couldn't see her, but he knew she was there. Yuna asked what the priestess had said. Doyeon replied that she'd said they could carry on. Yuna remained silent. Then she asked again. She asked what else she'd said. Doyeon turned around. Yuna stood with her back straight, looking at him. Her face was expressionless. Her hands were at her sides. A knife hung at her belt, that very same left-handed knife. Doyeon replied that Serin would return. Yuna nodded. She walked toward the smokehouse. On the 70th day, Doyeon decided it was time to think about the capital. Winter was past its midpoint, 3 months until spring. The royal decree required a steady catch throughout the winter. Doyeon did the math. In 2.5 months, the village had emerged from famine. It had established fishing, smoking, salting, drying, and the production of fish sauce. It had 1 boat with a gaff sail, a steady income at the Namhae market, a 3-week supply in the cellar. That was a lot for the 40 households that had been gnawing on tree bark just 3 months ago. But it wasn't enough to meet the royal decree. The decree required deliveries to the capital. The capital, Haedo, stood on the northern island of the archipelago. Between Chhansu-ri and Haedo lay 5 islands and 2 straits, waters controlled by the Silver Scale Guild. Not even a first step would make it through. A small boat with 3 people crossing the winter sea, without maps, without experience in long-distance voyages. It would be suicide. Doyeon needed allies, someone who knew these waters, someone who owned a ship, someone willing to take a risk. He was thinking about this when, on the 73rd day at the market in Namhae, a woman approached their stall. She was short, sturdy, with cold eyes, wearing expensive clothes that had seen better days, signet rings with coats of arms on her fingers. An aristocrat, but one of those whom life had worn down. She stopped in front of a stall selling smoked mackerel. She looked. She sniffed. Then she looked at Doyeon. She asked the price. Yuna named it, 2 scales apiece. The woman smirked. She said she'd take the whole batch for 1.5 scales apiece. 80 pieces, 120 scales, a wholesale purchase. Yuna opened her mouth to agree. Doyeon stopped her with a wave of his hand. He looked at the woman. He asked why she needed so many. The woman raised an eyebrow. She replied that it was none of his business. Doyeon shook his head. He said he was selling fish, not giving it away. If a customer wants a discount, the customer explains why they need such a large quantity. The woman looked at him. Doyeon could see the calculations running through her mind. Quick, professional. This woman had been counting money her whole life. She replied. She said her name was Hayoon Kim, that she was the heiress to the Kim family, 3rd-generation salt producers, that the Kim family was on the brink of bankruptcy because their salt couldn't compete with the large salt producers, and that she needed fish. A lot of fish, for a new product, salted fish in barrels. The Kim family supplies the salt. Chhansu-ri supplies the fish. They split the profits 50-50. Doyeon listened. He thought. Then he named his price. 2 scales per fish, no discount. Plus 1 condition. The Kim house would supply salt to Chhansu-ri at cost, no markup. Hayoon looked at him. She did the math. Doyeon could see the numbers racing behind her eyes. Then she said he was presumptuous. Doyeon replied that he was fair. Hayoon smirked. For the first time during the entire conversation, there was something resembling respect in her smirk. She said she'd think about it. And she left. Yuna turned to Doyeon and said that he'd just turned down an aristocrat. That you don't do that. That the Kim house is a name, even if it had fallen on hard times. Doyeon replied that that was exactly why she would come back. Because impoverished aristocrats couldn't afford to turn down a good deal. 3 days later, Hayoon Kim sent a messenger with a letter. The letter contained a single word. Agreed. Serin Chon spent a week in the village and wrote a positive report to the temple. She told Doyeon about a previous time traveler who had been burned at the stake 200 years ago, which confirmed the danger of his situation. Doyeon began planning his journey to the capital to carry out the royal decree. At the market in Namhae, he struck a trade agreement with Hayoon Kim, the heiress of an impoverished family of salt makers, which gave the village access to cheap salt and a wholesale distribution channel. Hayoon's salt arrived on the 80th day. 3 sacks carried on the backs of 2 porters she had sent from Namhae. White, pure, fine-grained. Salt from the Kim family. Doyeon tasted it on his tongue and nodded. Good. Not like the salt he'd evaporated on trays. Better. More uniformly ground. Free of sand impurities. With this salt, he could do things that hadn't worked before. Cold salting, a method in which fish is salted slowly and evenly at a low temperature. The flesh remains firm. It doesn't soften. It doesn't fall apart. It keeps for months. In Korea, they made chotgal this way. In Scandinavia, gravlax. Here, they didn't do it at all because there wasn't even enough salt for hot curing. Now, there was enough. Doyeon placed the first batch of cold-cured fish in the cellar, 20 large mackerels. Each was rubbed with salt and layered in a clay tub. Seaweed was placed between the layers for flavor. The tub was covered with a stone to act as a press. 10 days later, he took out the first fish. He cut it open. The flesh inside was pink, translucent when held up to the light, and firm as wood. He cut off a thin slice and put it in his mouth. He closed his eyes. The taste was such that, for a second, he found himself in Busan. In a small restaurant by the harbor where old man Kim Chol served hui made from fresh mackerel and poured soju without counting the cost. Doyeon opened his eyes. He was in a stone cellar, Chhansu-ri, another world. But the fish was the same. The sea is the same everywhere. He carried the fish upstairs, sliced it thinly, arranged it on a flat stone. He called Yoon, Taeseon, Minseo, and Daeho. Everyone tasted it. Taeseon chewed with his eyes closed. Minseo quietly said it was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted in her life. Daeho silently took a second piece, then a third. Yuna tasted it and said nothing, but Doyeon saw her swallow, and how her hand reached for a second slice before her mind had even decided. Hayoon arrived in person on the 85th day. Doyeon had been expecting this. She wasn't the type to trust messengers with important matters. She entered the village and stopped. She looked around. At the smokehouse from which smoke was rising. At the drying shed where rows of fish hung. At the double-walled cellar. At the people who were working. They weren't loitering. They weren't sitting against the walls. They were working. Doyeon could see how she was taking stock. Every detail, every unit of production, every pair of working hands. From the moment she stepped through the door, this woman was assessing the business like a professional auditor. He led her through the entire operation, showing her the traps, the nets, the racks, the smokehouse, the drying room, the cellar, the salt pans, the fish sauce stock, and the cold-cured fish. Hayoon tasted a slice of cold mackerel. She chewed slowly. Her expression didn't change. Then, she said she wanted to renegotiate the terms. Doyeon asked in what direction. Hayoon replied that she wanted the exclusive right to resell all Chhansu-ri products through the Kim House retail network. In return, the Kim House would handle logistics and storage. And one more thing. She wants the recipe for what she just tasted. Doyeon shook his head. The recipe isn't for sale, but he's willing to manufacture this product for the Kim House, under the Kim House brand, with his quality control. The profit split is 60-40. 60 for Chhansu-ri, 40 to Kim's house. Hayoon raised an eyebrow. She said it was outrageous. Doyeon replied that it was simple math. His product, his technology, his fish, her salt and logistics. 60-40 is fair. Hayoon was silent. She was calculating. Doyeon could see the numbers and options. Then she said 50-50. Doyeon said 55-45. Hayoon said she agreed. They sealed the deal in the only way that held weight in this world, with a handshake in front of witnesses. Yuna and Taeseon stood nearby. Hayoon shook Doyeon's hand. Her hand was cold and dry. Her grip was firm. She held his hand for a second longer than necessary. She looked him in the eyes. She said he was the first person in 5 years who had negotiated with her as an equal, not just as a name. Doyeon replied that names don't catch fish. Hayoon smiled. This time, it was genuine. She left that same day. But as she was saying goodbye, she said something that made Doyeon think. She said that Chae-young-il, the head of the Silver Scale Guild, knew about him. Not from informants at the market, from people at court. And that Young-il wasn't the type to set smokehouses on fire. He was the type to set villages on fire. Doyeon stood on the path and watched her walk away. The wind from the sea carried the scent of salt and cold. Winter was in full swing. And somewhere to the north, beyond 5 islands and 2 straits, sat a man who was deciding whether to destroy a small village for the sake of preserving his empire. On the 91st day, Doyeon organized the first communal meal. He had been planning this for a long time, ever since he'd noticed that every family ate separately, in their own huts behind closed doors, because they were ashamed to show their neighbors that their bowls were empty. Now the bowls were full, and Doyeon decided it was time. Taeseon and Junho set up a long table made of planks in the square by the well, and stretched a canvas awning over it. The women had been cooking since morning, under Doyeon's guidance. Thinly sliced smoked mackerel, salted roe, which Doyeon had learned to extract from horse mackerel without damaging the membrane. Sea urchin broth, thick, golden, with a scent that made your stomach churn. Rice balls with tuna that Daeho had brought from the outer deck. Dried flounder, soaked and pan-fried on a hot stone with fish liver oil. Fermented cabbage with anchovies. Doyeon had been making it for 3 weeks from memory, recreating kimchi with whatever ingredients were available. 40 families sat down at a single table, for the first time in years, perhaps in decades. Doyeon stood to the side and watched. The old woman Wo-hee sat next to Taeseong's mother. Between them was Nayeon, the girl who had once gnawed on tree bark. Now she was eating a rice ball with tuna, and her cheeks were round, not sunken, round. She had put on weight over the past 3 months. Grandfather Pon sat on the edge of the table and ate smoked fish with hands that could grip again. Minseo ran between the tables, pouring broth. Eunbi directed the teenagers who were serving the food. Junho sat quietly and smiled. Taeseon ate and shook his head, again and again. Daeho sat apart, on a rock slightly to the side. He ate in silence. But he ate at the communal table. That was important. The village elder stood up with a bowl. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He couldn't speak. His eyes were wet. His beard trembled. He stood there in silence, and everyone remained silent with him. Then he simply raised the bowl, and everyone raised theirs, without a word. Yuna stood next to Doyeon, quietly. Then she placed her hand on his shoulder. It was the first time she'd ever touched him of her own free will. Not out of necessity, not to convey anything. She just placed her hand there. Doyeon didn't move. He stood there, feeling the warmth of her palm through the fabric of his shirt. Minseo was crying into her bowl, not out of grief, out of something for which she had no word. Serin was sitting among the villagers. She had arrived 2 days ago, just as she had promised, not as a priestess, as a guest, in simple clothes without the wave symbol. She ate sea urchin broth and watched the people around her. And she thought that if the spirits of the sea existed, they were here, right now, at this table, among these people. Doyeon watched all this and, for the first time in 3 months, allowed himself to think that maybe he wasn't here for nothing. On the 100th day, Doyeon began preparing an expedition to the capital. He wasn't waiting for a royal decree. Winter would end in 2 months. He needed to deliver the fish to Haedo before spring, to prove that Chhansu-ri was capable of providing a stable catch, to secure a berth, and all of this through the guild's waters. The first step was too small for such a journey. A 7-step boat with a single sail wouldn't make it past the 5 islands in winter. He needed a ship, a real one. Doyeon didn't know where to get one until Hayoon sent a letter on the 103rd day. The letter stated that a merchant ship, impounded for debts, was moored in the port of Namhae, Western-built, 2-masted. It had arrived from the other side of the ocean 10 years ago. The captain had perished in a storm. The crew had scattered. The ship was rotting at the dock. The Namhae authorities would sell it to cover the debt. 300 scales. Hayoon was willing to contribute half. The village had 200 scales in savings, 150 from Hayoon. They were 50 short. Doyeon thought about it for 2 days. Then he went to the village head. He asked for money from the village fund, the money Yuna had been setting aside for a rainy day. The village head refused, immediately, bluntly. He said that the rainy day hadn't gone anywhere, that winter wasn't over, that the ship was madness. Doyeon didn't argue. That evening, Daeho brought the money. He walked into the shed. Silently, he set a small bag of scales on the floor. 53 pieces. It was all he had. Everything he'd saved up over the years. He didn't say a word. He turned around and left. Doyeon sat on the floor and stared at the little bag. 53 scales. A whole lifetime for a fisherman who, by law, isn't allowed to own a boat longer than 3 steps. In the morning, he went to Namhae with Yuna and Taeseon. Hayoon was waiting for them at the port. The ship was moored at the far pier. Doyeon saw it and stopped. A Western-style vessel. A caravel. Or something very much like a caravel. 2 masts. A hull of dark oak. The planking had darkened from the water and the passage of time, but the planks were sturdy. The keel was deep. This ship could sail the open ocean. He climbed aboard. The deck creaked but held firm. The masts stood straight. The rigging had rotted away, but the masts were intact. The hold was dry. The hull wasn't leaking. Someone had built this ship with great care. Doyeon went down to the captain's cabin. It was small, dark. A nautical chart lay on the table, worn. The lines had faded, but Doyeon could make out the outlines. The Haeyeon archipelago, all 47 islands. Straits, currents. The depths were marked with numbers. It was the best map he'd ever seen in this world. He rolled it up and tucked it into his coat. The transaction took an hour. The port official counted the scales. He stamped the transfer document. The ship was transferred to the Chhansu-ri artel. That was the first time Doyeon had called their group an artel. An artel. Not a village, not a brigade, an artel. Yuna wrote the name on a small board. She underlined it twice. Now they needed a captain, someone who knew how to steer a ship like this. Doyeon could read the sea. Daeho could sense the wind, but neither of them had ever sailed a 2-masted ship. The answer came that very same day. A redhead, freckled, with an accent that made every merchant at the market cringe. Ashley Carter was sitting in the Namhae Port Tavern, drinking something murky from a clay mug. Hayoon brought Doyeon to her. She said this was the daughter of the former captain of that very ship, that Ashley had been stranded in Haeyeon after her father's death. She gets by on odd jobs. No one hires a foreigner, especially not a woman. Doyeon sat down across from her. Ashley looked at him. Her eyes were red, not from tears, but from cheap booze. She asked what he wanted. Doyeon replied that he had bought her father's ship. Ashley dropped her mug. The booze spilled across the table. She stared at him, her mouth agape, her eyes clear, sober in an instant. Doyeon said he needed a captain, a man who knows this ship, who has sailed on it, who knows how to navigate it through the winter straits. He was ready to offer her a share in the artel and a seat at the table. Ashley was silent. Then she asked why she would need that. The ship wasn't hers anymore. She owed this stranger nothing. Doyeon replied that he wasn't looking for a debtor. He was looking for a captain, and that the ship remembers the hands that steered it, and that those hands remember the ship. Ashley stood up. She walked silently out of the tavern. Doyeon didn't follow her. Yuna asked if they should go after her. Doyeon said they shouldn't. 3 hours later, Ashley was standing on the dock by the ship. Her hand was on the deck. Her fingers were stroking the wood. She wasn't crying, but she was breathing so heavily it was as if she were carrying an anchor on her shoulders. Then she turned to Doyeon, who was standing 10 paces away, waiting. She said the masts needed to be re-rigged, that the rigging had to be completely replaced, that the rudder seized up on left turns, and that if he thought she was going to call him captain, he was wrong. Doyeon said she was the captain here, and he was just a man who caught fish. Ashley snorted. Then, for the first time during the conversation, she smiled. A bitter, brief smile from someone who had suddenly realized that life wasn't over yet. The ship's repairs took 20 days. Ashley was in charge. Doyeon listened. Yuna kept track of the expenses. Taeseon and Junho came from the village to help. Daeho brought first step and hauled materials around the bay. New ropes, new sails made from the fabric Hayoon had bought, a new rudder carved from a single piece of wood according to Ashley's blueprint. She knew this ship like the back of her hand. Every piece, every seam, every bolt. When the sail was hoisted and caught the wind, Ashley stood at the stern with her hands on the helm, gazing out to sea. Doyeon stood beside her. He was silent. Ashley spoke just one sentence. She said that her father had named the ship Salt Wind. Doyeon said the name would remain. The salty wind set sail from Namhae on the 130th day. On board were Doyeon, Ashley at the helm, Daeho tending the sails, Taeseon and Junho as the crew, and Yuna with the cargo manifest. In the hold lay the fish, 200 smoked mackerel, 100 bundles of dried fish, 50 tubs of cold-cured fish, 20 bottles of fish sauce, and 1 barrel, a special one. Doyeon had prepared it himself, fermented horse mackerel roe aged for 40 days in rice bran. It was the first time in his life he'd done this. He was recreating from memory a recipe he'd once seen at a factory in Hokkaido. He'd find out if it turned out right when he opened the barrel in front of the king. If he made it to the king, that is. The first day went smoothly. Ashley steered the ship south along the coast and then west through the first strait. The wind was favorable. The waves were low. The ship sailed smoothly. Doyeon stood at the bow and gazed out at the sea. The winter sea. Dark, heavy, beautiful. He thought about how, 3 months ago, he had been lying on the sand, spitting out seaweed. And now he was standing on the ship's deck, carrying fish to the king. Life takes turns sharper than any serpentine road. On the second day, they spotted sails. 3 boats were heading straight for them, fast, light. Flags with a silver fish flew from their masts. The guild. Yuna turned pale. Taeseon grabbed the boat hook. Daeho stood at the rail and watched in silence. Ashley didn't flinch. She shouted to change the sails. The Salt Wind, with its 2 masts and gaff sails, was faster than any guild ship. He turned the ship closer to the wind. The guild ships, with their square sails, couldn't maintain that course. They fell behind, slowly but surely. 2 hours later, their pursuers were left behind. Ashley stood at the stern, her hands on the helm, her red hair blowing in the wind. She turned to Doyeon and said, "Not bad for a fisherman." Doyeon replied that it was all thanks to her, the ship, and the captain. Ashley turned away, but he could see she was smiling. The third day brought a storm, not a strong one by open ocean standards, but enough for 3-meter waves to roll across the deck. Doyeon tied himself to the mast and held on. Taeseon was thrown overboard. Junho turned pale but kept working. Daeho stood on the deck like a rock. This man was born at sea, and the sea could not frighten him. Ashley steered the ship through the waves with such confidence, as if she were playing an instrument she'd known since childhood. The storm ended by nightfall. On the morning of the 4th day, they saw the capital. Haedo lay on the northern island of the archipelago. A port. A real large port. Dozens of ships at the docks. Stone piers, warehouse buildings, a lighthouse tower on the cape. Doyeon looked on and realized the scale of where he had ended up. Chhansu-ri was a dot on the map. Namhae was a small town. Haedo was a city. They entered the harbor under the stares of strangers. a Western-built ship with a crew in wet, tattered clothes. The port official was reluctant to let them dock for a long time. Yuna presented a trade certificate from the Kim family. The official grimaced but let them through. The name Kim still carried some weight. Hayoon knew exactly what she was doing when she gave them that certificate. They unloaded their cargo. Doyeon rented a spot at the port market, a small one in the far corner. Expensive, 30 scales a day. He set out his wares: smoked mackerel, dried fish, cold-cured fish, and fish sauce. People in the capital ate a different kind of fish. Imported, expensive, guild certified. But the capital had never tasted what Doyeon had brought. The first day dragged on. 10 customers. City folk are picky. They eye unfamiliar goods with suspicion. On the second day, a woman approached their stall. Short, sturdy, a stern face, a cook's hands, broad palms with scars from burns. She stood there looking at the fish sauce, then at the smoked mackerel, then at Doyeon. She asked if she could try the sauce. Doyeon opened the bottle. He handed her a wooden stick. The woman dipped it in. She tasted it. She froze. She licked the stick again, slowly, with her eyes closed. Then she opened them and looked at Doyeon as if she were seeing him for the first time. She asked who had made it. Doyeon replied that he had. The woman was silent. Then she said her name was Bo-Ra Lim, that she was a cook. She had been the head chef of the royal kitchen. She had been, until intrigues had driven her out of there. Now she lives alone near Namhae. She cooks noodles for pennies. And that this sauce is the best thing she's made in 20 years at the stove. Then she asked the most important question. She asked where he'd learned to make it and begged him to tell the truth. Doyeon looked at her, at her hands, at the scars from burns, at her eyes, which held something he recognized, a longing for mastery, for that moment when hands do what they were made to do. He told the truth, not the whole truth, but enough. He said he'd come from far away, that in his homeland they'd learned to turn fish into anything, that he had the knowledge in his head but lacked the hands, and that he needed someone who understood flavor. Bo-Ra listened. Then she said she needed to think it over. She left. She returned 2 hours later with a pot of hot noodles. She set it down in front of Doyeon. She said it was a down payment. If his noodles were worse than hers, she'd walk away. Doyeon tasted them. The noodles were magnificent. The broth was rich. The noodles were springy. The greens were fresh. He said his noodles were worse. Bo-Ra nodded. She said that, in that case, they had a deal. On the 5th day in the capital, a man dressed as a palace servant approached their market stall. He said that word had reached the court about an unusual merchant from the south, and that the manager of the royal storeroom was inviting the fisherman from Chhansu-ri to present his goods for evaluation. Doyeon looked at Yuna. Yuna looked at him. This was their chance, their only one. The very reason they had crossed 5 islands and 2 straits through the winter sea. Haedo Palace stood on a hill above the harbor. White walls, black roofs. Gates made of ironwood and bound with bronze. Doyeon walked along the stone path, carrying a barrel of fermented roe on his shoulders. Behind him was Yuna with a basket of smoked mackerel, Taeseon with a tub of cold-cured fish, and Bo-Ra. Bo-Ra walked last, in clean clothes, with her back straight, with the face of someone returning to the place from which they had been cast out. The manager of the royal storeroom turned out to be a small, fussy man with quick eyes. He led them into the tasting room, a low table, cushions on the floor, walls of light wood. Doyeon arranged the products on the table. The manager watched. Then he tasted it. Smoked mackerel. He broke off a piece, sniffed it, put it in his mouth, chewed slowly. His expression didn't change. A true professional. Then the cold-cured fish, a thin slice of pink flesh. Transparent, dense. The manager put it in his mouth and froze. Doyeon saw his eyes widen slightly, a sign an ordinary person wouldn't notice. Then the fish sauce. The manager dipped his finger in, licked it, looked at Doyeon, for the first time with an expression that wasn't a professional mask. Then Doyeon opened the barrel. Fermented caviar, 40 days in rice bran, tiny orange grains in a thick paste with a scent that was at once salty, sweet, and deep. The manager took a small spoon. He tasted it. He closed his eyes. He opened them. He closed them again. When he opened them for the third time, his face was different. He asked, in a voice stripped of all its usual restlessness, if this fisherman could wait. Doyeon said he could. The manager left. He returned half an hour later. He wasn't alone. Behind him walked two men in clothes that cost more than Doyeon's entire ship. And a third, a short man of about 45, an unremarkable face, calm eyes. His clothes were rich, but without excess. Yuna, standing next to Doyeon, held her breath. Then she slowly dropped to her knees. Taeseon followed her. Bo-Ra bowed deeply. She recognized that face, King Haegyong. Doyeon bowed, not on his knees, a bow. Deep, respectful, sufficient. The king sat down at the table, silently. The steward handed him some fermented caviar. The king tasted it. He chewed. He swallowed. He remained silent. Doyeon stood and waited. The silence was so thick that he could hear his own heart beating. The king looked at him. He asked where he was from. Doyeon replied that he was from the village of Chhansu-ri on the southern coast. The king asked how long the village had been producing this kind of fish. Doyeon replied, 3 months. The king raised an eyebrow. 3 months ago, Chhansu-ri had been on the list of villages on the brink of extinction. He knew. Doyeon could see that the king knew. This man knew his kingdom well. The king tasted the smoked mackerel, the cold-cured fish, the fish sauce. After each taste, he remained silent. Doyeon waited. Then the king spoke. He said that the decree regarding the wharf was still in effect, that over the winter, 14 petitioners had come to him, all with fish, all with promises. Not a single one had brought anything like this. Then he asked what the fishermen from Chhansu-ri wanted. Doyeon replied, a dock in Haedo, a license for a cooperative outside the guilds, the right to trade on all the islands. And one thing that none of the 14 had asked for, the right to teach others, any village that wanted it, for free. The king looked at him for a long time. Then he asked why. If Doyeon's technology became common knowledge, it would lose its value. Why give away for free what could be sold? Doyeon replied that hungry people don't buy. Hungry people are fed. And once they're back on their feet, they'll start buying and selling themselves and paying taxes to the royal treasury. This isn't charity. It's an investment. The king remained silent. The advisors behind him exchanged glances. Then the king said he would give his answer in 3 days. They left the palace. Yuna walked beside Doyeon and said nothing. Then she said he was crazy, that he could have asked for anything, land, a title, money, but he asked for the right to teach. Doyeon replied that land and a title wouldn't feed the 47 islands, but knowledge would. Yuna shook her head. Then she said quietly that he was still crazy, but the right kind of crazy. Those 3 days of waiting were the longest of Doyeon's life. He couldn't sit still. He walked around the harbor. He looked at the ships. He counted. He thought. Bo-Ra was cooking on the ship and said nothing. Ashley was repairing the rigging and said nothing. Everyone was silent. Everyone was waiting. On the second day of waiting, what Doyeon had feared happened. People from the guild appeared at the pier, 4 of them, with knives on their belts. They stood there and looked at the salt wind. They didn't approach, they just stood there. A warning. Daeho stepped out onto the deck. He stood at the rail. He crossed his arms. He looked down at them from above. 4 against 1. But Daeho was bigger and fiercer. They left an hour later, but Doyeon knew they would return. On the third day, a palace messenger arrived with a scroll. Doyeon unrolled it. The king's seal. Red. Heavy. The text in 4 lines. The Chhansu-ri is granted a berth in the port of Sodo, a license to trade in fish and fish products on all the islands of the archipelago. The right to teach fishing in any village of the kingdom. Exemption from guild fees for a period of 5 years. The king's signature. Yuna read it twice. Then she pressed the scroll to her chest and closed her eyes. Taeseon sat down on the deck and clasped his head in his hands. Bo-Ra turned away toward the stove. Her shoulders were shaking. Ashley stood at the stern, gazing out to sea. She was silent. Daeho stood by the mast, looking at the scroll in Yuna's hands. His expression remained unchanged, but the hands holding the rope were trembling. Doyeon stood in the middle of the deck, the scroll in his hands. The king's seal. 3 months. 90 days ago, he had been lying on the sand, spitting out seaweed. Now he held in his hands a document that would change the history of 40 estates and 6 villages. It was more than any dissertation, more than any grant. It was life. Real life. They returned to Chhansu-ri on the 142nd day. Spring was near. A southerly wind carried warmth. The sea grew lighter with each passing day, from the dark of winter to the clarity of spring. The village greeted them on the shore. Everyone was there. Minseo ran up first, barefoot on the wet sand. She ran into Doyeon and threw her arms around him. She cried into his shirt. She said she thought they wouldn't come back, that every night she went out to the shore and looked at the sea, that grandmother Wolhee kept a lamp burning in the window, that Eunbi had been weaving nets non-stop because when her hands were busy, her mind didn't dwell on bad thoughts. Doyeon placed his hand on the top of her head. Her hair was wet and disheveled. Her shoulders were thin. He told her he was back, that everything was fine. Minseo lifted her head. Her face was wet. Her eyes were red. She asked if it was true that everything was all right. Doyeon took out a scroll. He unrolled it. He showed her the seal. Minseo didn't know how to read seals, but Yuna, standing nearby, said one word. The pier. And Minseo began to cry again, but differently this time. The news spread throughout the village within an hour. People came and looked at the scroll. They touched the seal with their fingers. They shook their heads. The village elder was the last to arrive, old, hunchbacked. He took the scroll. He read it for a long time. His lips moved. Then he looked at Doyeon. There was something in his eyes that Doyeon had never seen before. Not gratitude. Shame. Shame for having wanted to drive him away, for having called him a vagabond, for not having believed him. The village elder bowed, deeply. Doyeon lifted him by the shoulders. He said it wasn't necessary, that they'd done everything together, that without the village, he wouldn't have been able to build anything on his own. The village elder nodded. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and went back to his room. But an hour later, he returned with a jug, rice wine, the real thing. He'd been saving it for 5 years, for a special occasion. That occasion had arrived. The following days were filled with work. Doyeon didn't stop. The royal charter offered protection but brought no peace. The Silver Scale Guild still stood. Chae-young-il was still alive and angry. Hayoon warned that Young-il wasn't the type to give up. But Doyeon knew what had to be done. Not to fight, to win through taste. On the 150th day, he sent an invitation to the royal court via Hayoon. He requested an audience, not for himself, but for the case, the trial regarding trade disputes between the Chhansu Guild and the Silver Scale Guild. The guild accused the Chhansu Guild of poaching and violating guild privileges. The Chhansu Guild accused the Silver Scale Guild of setting fire to the smokehouse and pursuing them at sea. Doyeon knew that in court, it is not the one who shouts the loudest who wins, but the one who presents evidence. His evidence was the fish. The trial took place on the 160th day in the court chamber at the royal palace. The ceiling was low, heavy beams. The judge's table on a raised platform. The royal judge, 3 advisors, a scribe, witnesses. Chae-young-il sat on one side. Doyeon saw him for the first time. A 52-year-old man, a broad face, dark eyes, the hands of a former fisherman, large, strong, but with the bearing of authority. This man had risen from the lowest ranks to become head of the guild in 30 years, every step through mud and blood. He looked at Doyeon without hatred, with interest, like a fisherman looking at an unfamiliar fish, trying to understand what kind of creature it was. The guild's witnesses spoke for 2 hours. The charges? Poaching, illegal fishing, violation of the monopoly, theft of trade secrets, and insulting guild traditions. Doyeon listened in silence. Yuna, sitting next to him, clenched her fists under the table. Then Doyeon stood up. He didn't try to justify himself. He didn't make accusations. He said one thing. He asked the court for permission to conduct a comparison. The judge granted permission. Doyeon placed 2 bowls on the table. One contained smoked mackerel from the Chhansu artel. The other contained salted fish from the Silver Scale Guild. Both were fresh. Both were produced during the same period. The judge looked at them. He tasted one. He tasted the other. The counselors tasted them. The clerk tasted it. The courtroom was silent. The difference was visible to the naked eye. The artel's fish was golden, firm, with the aroma of smoke and the sea. The guild's fish was gray, flaky, with a smell that suggested it had begun to spoil even before it was salted. Doyeon said one more thing. He said that in 3 months of operation, the Chhansu artel hadn't caught a single young fish. All the traps and nets are designed for adult fish. The young fish pass through freely. They return, they spawn, they produce a new generation. The artel takes from the sea exactly as much as the sea can give without being depleted. The guild takes everything. That's why the fish are gone. Not because of spirits, not because of a curse, because of greed. The hall fell silent. Chae-young-il sat motionless, his face stony. But Doyeon saw his hands. They rested on his knees, and his fingers were white with tension. The royal judge handed down his ruling an hour later. The Silver Scale Guild was stripped of its monopoly on fishing in the southern waters. The Changsu Cooperative received confirmation of all its royal privileges. The guild was ordered to pay compensation for the arson of the smokehouse. The hall emptied slowly. People dispersed. The guild members were silent. Yuna gathered the papers, her face that of someone who couldn't believe what had happened. Taeseon stood by the door and smiled, for the first time in all the years Doyeon had known him, broadly and openly. Doyeon was the last to leave the hall. Young-il was waiting for him on the palace steps, alone, without an entourage, an old fisherman and a young one. They stood facing each other. Young-il spoke first. He said that Doyeon had destroyed his life's work, 30 years of it. Doyeon replied that he hadn't, that the guild could operate differently. It could teach the fishermen instead of stifling them. It could fish the right way, not greedily. It could become what it was meant to be from the very beginning, a fisherman's union, not a prison. Young-il was silent. Then he said he had a daughter. She was sick. He'd clung to the guild for her sake, because doctors were expensive and medicine was even more so. Doyeon was silent for a moment. Then he took a clay bottle out of his bag and held it out. He said it was a concentrated broth made from the bones and cartilage of deep-sea fish. He'd simmered it for a week. Thick, dark, full of calcium and collagen. Not medicine, but for aching joints and weak bones, it was better than any medicine money could buy. Young-il looked at the bottle, then at Doyeon, at the bottle again. Then he took it. His hand was shaking. Not from weakness, from something else. He turned and walked away. After 10 steps, he stopped. He didn't turn around. He said quietly that the fish had been delicious, the one on the boat. Then he left. Doyeon stood on the palace steps and watched him go. Yuna approached. She stood beside him. She asked why he'd given the broth to a man who'd tried to destroy them. Doyeon replied that this man had a sick daughter. And the fish Doyeon prepares is always for a specific person. Yuna looked at him for a long time. Then she quietly said 3 words. She said he was a good person. And she took his hand. For the first time, she simply took it and held it. They were standing on the steps of the palace in the capital, Haegyong. The wind from the sea carried warmth. Spring was approaching the shores. Doyeon felt the warmth of her hand, and for the first time in 5 months, he didn't need to think about his next move. He could just stand there, just breathe, just be there. They returned to Chhansu-ri at the end of winter. The last of the cold was receding. The sea was changing. Every day, Doyeon would go down to the shore and look out at the water. Something was changing. He could feel it in his bones, that sixth sense that comes to a person after thousands of hours on the water. Serin arrived on the 171st day, not in the blue robes of a priestess, in plain clothes, without the wave symbol. She had left the temple. She wrote to the senior priestesses that her place was not within the temple walls, but by the sea, that she would serve the water spirits where they lived, among the people, among the fishermen, among those who feed and those who are fed. She came to Chhansu-ri and told Doyeon that she would stay, if he didn't mind. Doyeon didn't mind. Yuna stood nearby as Serin spoke. Her face was calm. A left-handed knife hung from her belt. She looked at Serin, then at Doyeon. Then she turned away and walked toward the smokehouse to check on the fish, just like every evening. On the 181st day, Doyeon stood on the new pier at Haedo Port, the Chhansu Cooperative's pier, his pier. A flag hung from the pole at the entrance, blue, with a silver fish. Minseo had painted it herself. 3 nights, with a squirrel hair brush. The fish turned out a little crooked, but it was alive, just like Minseo herself. Yuna stood next to Doyeon, with her order notebook. A notebook made of real paper, the first paper the village had ever bought with its own money. Minseo stood a little further away, wearing the apron of a junior brigade instructor. In 3 months, she had taught 20 teenagers from 4 villages how to weave nets and set traps. The teacher's book of wise words had grown to 14 bamboo tablets. Serin stood by the pier railing in an elegant dress. She looked out at the water and smiled, the quiet smile of someone who had finally found the place where she wanted to be. Hayoon stood holding the seal of the Chhansu Kim trading house, a joint brand, her salt and his fish. In its first month of operation, the trading house had paid off all of the Kim family's debts. For the first time in 5 years, Hayoon was wearing clothes she had chosen herself, rather than whatever was left over. Ashley stood on the deck of the Saltwind. Her hands were on the helm. The ship had been completely repaired. Fresh rigging, new sails. Ashley had brought it here across the winter sea, and it hadn't let her down. Neither had its captain. Bo-Ra stood in the kitchen of the new harbor eatery, Artel's first eatery in the capital. Steam rose from the chimney. The air smelled of broth and fried fish. Bo-Ra was cooking again. Not for the court, not for money, for the people who came in from the sea, hungry and exhausted. For specific people with specific hunger. That was the whole point. A royal messenger was walking along the path to the pier, a young man, with a scroll in his hand. Doyeon looked at him and already knew what was in the scroll. An official decree regarding the pier, signed by the king himself, sealed with the royal seal. The messenger approached. He bowed. He held out the scroll. Doyeon took it, unrolled it, read it. The lines blurred, not from tears. Doyeon wasn't crying. It was just the wind from the sea stinging his eyes. A strong wind, salty. He rolled up the scroll. He looked at the people around him, at each one. Yuna, Minseo, Serin, Hayoon, Ashley, Bo-Ra, Taeseon and Junho on deck, Daeho on the shore, Eunbi with a group of teenagers, grandmother Wolhee on a bench by the wall, Grandpa Pon next to her, Nayeon, the girl who used to gnaw on tree bark. Now she stood with a rice ball in her hand, gazing out at the sea. Her cheeks were round, her eyes were bright, lively, healthy, well-fed. Doyeon allowed himself to smile, a real smile, for the first time since the day he woke up on the sand. And then a breeze came in from the sea. Strange, warm, unseasonable. It brushed against Doyeon's hair. It swept across his face, gently, like a palm. And there was something in that breeze. A sound, not a sound, a sensation. A word without a voice. A word that Doyeon felt not with his ears, but with his chest, where his heart beats. Thank you. He looked at the water. The water looked back at him. Dark, deep, alive. The ocean that had called him here, that had pulled him out of the black waters of the bay in Busan and cast him onto the sand of a foreign world, which gave him a second chance. Not for himself, for them, for the 40 households gnawing on tree bark, for the children who had stopped crying from hunger, for the old people who gave away their rations, for the fishermen who were forbidden to fish, for the women who mended rags, thinking they were nets. For everyone. Doyeon placed his hand on the wooden railing of the pier. Worn, salty, real. Somewhere far out in the open ocean, beyond 5 islands and 2 straits, the first school was turning toward the shore. Silver mackerel, thousands of fish, tens of thousands. They were heading for the shores of Haeon, for the first time in 3 years. The great silence was ending. Doyeon couldn't see them, but he knew they were coming, because the wind smelled different. Because the seagulls were crying out differently. Because the water was changing color. He knew the sea. The sea knew him. He turned to Yuna. She was standing next to him, close by, a left-handed knife on her belt. The wind ruffled her hair, weather-beaten hands. Her back was straight. She looked at him and waited. Doyeon said the fish were coming. Yuna looked at the sea, then at him. She asked how he knew. Doyeon replied that he just knew, and he smiled. Yuna didn't smile. She never smiled just like that. But her eyes were warm, like a fire in a smokehouse on a winter night. She took his hand, firmly, with a working grip, the way you hold a tool, the way you hold something you have no intention of letting go of. Doyeon squeezed back in response. They stood on the pier they'd built together, among people who trusted one another, in a country that was learning to feed itself all over again. The wind carried the scent of salt, fish, and spring from the sea, and somewhere far away, a silver mackerel was swimming toward the shore. Home.